Subcommittees will come to order, and good afternoon. And welcome to today's joint hearing of the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations, and the Subcommittee on the Middle East and North Africa, as we turn our attention to an overlooked aspect of the crisis in Syria, the religious minorities caught in the middle of the conflict and apparently targeted by government forces as well as rebel groups. More than 93,000 Syrians have been killed in this horrendous and seemingly endless civil war. More than 4.25 million people are displaced within Syria, and millions more are fleeing to safety in the surrounding countries of Jordan, Turkey, Lebanon, and Iraq. It is disturbing to note that 1 in 5 of the refugees is Christian, although Christians in Syria make up 1 in 10 of the pre-war population of 22 million people. This would seem to indicate that Christians are even more fearful for their lives and safety than other segments of the Syrian population. Before the war, Syria was a fairly pluralistic society with Alawites, Shias, Ismailis, Yazidis, Druze, Christians, Jews, Sunnis, living in relative peace side by side. The situation was far from perfect, as President Bashar Assad's regime had a vast security apparatus in place, with members inside each of the religious communities to monitor their activities. The Assad government was guilty of serious human rights violations, including the summary imprisonment and execution of political prisoners. But relations between various religious groups was generally not violent. That civil coexistence has ended with the war. In February of this year, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Syrian Arab Republic reported that, and I quote, "The conflict has become increasingly sectarian, with the conduct of the parties becoming significantly more radicalized and militarized." This followed on an earlier commission report stating that, quote, "Entire communities are at risk of being forced out of the country or being killed inside the country, with communities believing, and not without cause, that they face an existential threat." We know that early in the civil war, Assad came to view the Christian minority with suspicion, accusing churches of laundering money and goods for opposition forces and forbidding banks from transactions for certain churches. There is also evidence that the Assad regime encouraged sectarian tensions in order to maintain power, perhaps believing that if people were afraid of Islamists commandeering a nominally secular state, the people would be more likely to support Assad over the opposition. In December of 2012, Time magazine reported allegations that the Assad regime was paying individuals to pose as opposition supporters and chant slogans at protests, including "the Christians to Beirut" and "the Alawites to the grave." Our own government has voiced concern about the particular threat posed to Christians in Syria. According to the State Department's International Religious Freedom Report for 2012, quote, "The regime continued to frame opposition actions as targeting the Christian population. At the same time, it increased its own targeting of Christian and Alawi anti-regime activists in order to eliminate minority voices that might counter its narrative of Sunni-sponsored violence." Religious minorities seem to fear the opposition forces. Some prominent opposition groups, such as the Muslim Brotherhood, have a religious basis which has been seen as threatening to Syria's Alawite and Christian minorities. Smaller opposition factions, such as the al-Qaeda-affiliated Jihadist al-Nusra Front, take explicitly sectarian positions. There are reports of incidents in which rebel forces engaged in sectarian violence, such as burning Shiite mosques. Christians are perceived by many in the opposition to be Assad loyalists, possibly due to Assad's aggressive recruitment of Christians into the regime militias at the start of the civil war. Other reports indicate that Christians attempted to remain neutral, either out of pacifism or concern about their rights under opposition forces. Christian neutrality was perceived by some opposition groups as loyalty to the regime. In December of 2012, a rebel force believed to be associated with the Muslim Brotherhood released a YouTube entitled "Warning Mainly Christian Cities in the Provinces of Hamal," and promising attacks if they continue to support the house pro-Assad forces. Christian leaders have been targeted, such as the April 2013 kidnappings of 2 Syriac Orthodox Church and bishops. Both men have still not been returned. The Jewish community reports being targeted as well. In March of 2013, a Jewish leader reported to Christian Solidarity International, who will testify today, our people get stopped at checkpoints and are asked which sect they belong to. Once the militias hear that they are Swahili, a province where 90% of the population is Druze, our men disappear. The Al-Nusra Front, a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization, has been blamed for much of the sectarian rhetoric and violence, but dozens of the opposition groups ascribe to an Islamic jihadist ideologies and mingle with the Free Syrian Army, which the U.S. may now be supporting. Over the last 3 years, the United States has committed to providing $250 million to various opposition groups in Syria, at least $117 million of which has already been funded, largely to the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces. With the chemical weapon red line crossed, the administration has also agreed to provide ammunition and small arms as well. It is not clear whether any of this new lethal assistance will go to the Free Syrian Army and its worrisome opposition groups. The administration also committed to send an additional $300 million in humanitarian aid to, quote, vulnerable groups in and around Syria. It is not clear whether distribution of this aid will be informed by the plight of religious minorities. I am very concerned that the administration may not be taking seriously enough the targeting of religious minorities, which is why we've called this hearing. Too often we have heard from the administration that they have bigger issues to deal with than the vulnerability of religious minorities. In the last 2 appropriation cycles, we have directed the administration to condition aid, for example, to Egypt, some $1.3 billion, on certification that Egypt is acting to protect the religious freedom of its minorities. The administration, both Secretaries Clinton and Secretary Kerry, refused to do so and waived it. Perhaps not surprisingly, the government of Egypt continues to allow attacks on Coptic Christians with impunity. I've actually chaired 3 hearings on the targeting of Coptic Christians, and I do believe much more needs to be done and robustly done to protect this minority in Egypt. Money does talk. The United States should be using assistance to ensure recipient countries and entities have a plan, ensure that they have a plan that is implemented to protect vulnerable religious minorities. And with that, I look forward to hearing the testimony of our distinguished witness from the administration, but I would like to ask Mr. Schneider if he has any comments, and then go to Randy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for calling this very important hearing. As you rightly indicated, the sectarian violence in Syria is an overlooked aspect of what we're seeing as events unfold, with over 93,000 people already believed to be killed, number possibly being even much higher. It is critical as we look forward to moving Syria in a different direction that we take into consideration how we create a future for Syria that does not lead to further sectarian violence and oppression of minorities. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses and increasing our understanding on this crucial issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. The distinguished Vice Chairman of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Genocide is defined as the deliberate killing of a large group of people, especially those of a particular ethnicity or religion. Today, more than at any other time in modern history, religious minorities are regularly persecuted, kidnapped, tortured, and murdered in Syria, and throughout the Middle East for that matter. They are experiencing the true definition of genocide. The Pew Research Institute indicates that Christians are targeted for governmental and societal persecution more than any other religious group. Sadly, an estimated 100,000 Christians are killed for their faith every single year, according to a recent United Nations report. And yet, the media is complicit in this genocide by failing to shine a light on the plight of those being annihilated. Their failure to inform the public prevents accountability and action. Ignorant or not, as policymakers, we are all just as at fault for our failure to step in and help and protect the helpless. After World War II, a war in which my father fought, and he's one of the last of the living greatest generation, by the way, we made a promise to the world never to forget. We echoed that promise after 9/11. We would never forget. A promise to the world after World War II that we would ensure that it never happened again. But we have failed over and over again. In Cambodia, in the Congo, in the Darfur, in Iraq, in Rwanda, and in places, quite frankly, too numerous to mention. Countless millions have died in genocides which occurred following our promise that we would never let it happen again. At what point do we say, enough is enough? Our word has to mean something. Thousands are crying out to us to pay attention and for us to act. And it is our moral obligation as the world's leading superpower to do so, because it is who we are as a nation and a people. To quote Reverend Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a Lutheran pastor who actively spoke out against the Nazi regime in Germany, not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. He also said, and I quote him here, "We are not to simply bandage the wounds of the victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself." Realizing that the magnitude of the numbers can be overwhelming and awful paralyzing, perhaps we need to narrow our vision down to the one, capital O-N-E, who motivates action. As those with knowledge of actual events on the ground, I look to our witnesses today to give us not only some of those individual accounts of what is happening within Syria, but also ways that we might engage and hold us accountable, by the way, that we would be held accountable for the promises that we made even to as a previous generation. I would much rather be on the side of those speaking and acting than those who stayed at home. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Weber. Mr. Kennedy.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I just wanted to thank you for calling an important hearing and look forward to what our witnesses have to say on the issue.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Yellow?
Mr. Speaker, not right now.
Okay. Mr. Collins? Thank you. I'd like to now introduce our distinguished panelists from the administration, the DAS, Deputy Assistant Secretary Thomas Melia, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. He is responsible for its work in Europe, including Russia and the countries of the Middle East and North Africa region. He came to DRL in 2010 from Freedom House, where he was Deputy Executive Director for 5 years. Earlier, Mr. Melia worked at the National Democratic Institute, the AFL-CIO, and on Capitol Hill. In addition, he has taught democracy and human rights courses at Georgetown University and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and did that for more than 10 years. Without objection, your full bio will be made a part of the record, and the floor is yours.
Chairman Smith and members of the subcommittees, thank you for inviting me here to discuss the situation for religious and other minorities in Syria today. I request that the full prepared testimony be included in the record, and I'll just give you a summary of...
Without objection, so ordered.
Syria looks disturbingly different today than it did at the start of the revolution. What started 2 years ago as a peaceful demand for human rights in Daraa has turned into a devastating nationwide conflict with a growing human toll. the Assad regime continues to commit gross and systematic violations of human rights. Mr. Chairman, you recited the numbers. I don't need to repeat them here. But the last several months have been particularly concerning. We've seen increasing sectarian undertones in the horrific massacres at Baida, Banayas, and Qusair. Indeed, the UN Commission of Inquiry's June 4 report underscores that crimes against humanity have become a daily reality for the people of Syria. For centuries, Syria has been a rich tapestry of religious and ethnic groups, including the Sunnis, the Alawis, Ismailis, Shia, Druze, and different Christian communities. The regime has provoked and attempted to divide Syria's population by driving a wedge between these minorities and the Sunni majority. The regime continues to target faith groups it deems a threat, including members of the country's Sunni majority and numerous religious minorities. Such targeting includes killing, detention, and harassment. Regime attacks have also destroyed religious sites, including more than 1,000 mosques and an undetermined number of other houses of worship, including churches. The attacks in Qusair marked a dangerous new precedent of direct sectarian threats by Hezbollah's forces fighting at the behest of the regime. Over 200 civilians were killed and many more wounded who now desperately need humanitarian assistance. We've also seen al-Qaeda-linked groups and other violent extremist groups engaged in gross human rights abuses. We've seen several reports of violent extremists conducting massacres of Shia civilians as well as destroying a Shia mosque. Many Christians, moreover, have reported receiving threats on their lives if they do not join the opposition efforts against the regime and have been driven from their homes and killed en masse as presumed supporters of the regime. Syrian Orthodox Archbishop Yohanna Ibrahim and Greek Orthodox Archbishop Paul Yazigi were kidnapped on April 22nd by persons unknown and remain missing to this day. The Nusra Front has claimed responsibility for bombings across the country. A 15-year-old boy was executed for blasphemy this month by extremists in Aleppo who, reports tell us, have come from outside the country to fight the regime. These extremist groups do not support the aspirations, nor do they reflect the mindset of the vast majority of the Syrian people, or even the vast majority of the active Syrian opposition. The atrocities committed by these extremist elements should not be conflated with the efforts by the moderate opposition, including the Supreme Military Council, to seek an end to the Assad regime and to facilitate an orderly political transition. In fact, the list of targets that these extreme groups have developed is increasingly long and includes Sunnis and virtually all the minorities. In a recent interview with The Economist magazine, one Nusra Front fighter stated that even Sunnis who want democracy are to be considered unbelievers who deserve to be punished. Sectarian-based retribution plays directly into the regime's and violent extremists' hands. It does not move the country closer to the inclusive post-Assad future that Syrians have been struggling to achieve. In our conversations with opposition military leaders, we have consistently urged opposition groups to respect international law and human rights, and we have applauded those groups that signed on to the Code of Conduct issued by the Free Syrian Army in the fall of 2012. We continue to try to help bring an end to the violent conflict by strengthening the moderate opposition, blocking the Assad regime's access to cash and weapons, facilitating a political transition to end Assad's rule, and providing substantial humanitarian assistance, as well as laying the groundwork for an inclusive democratic transition, including accountability for egregious violations committed. We're also working closely with our allies to stem the flow of money and resources to violent extremist groups. We believe that a political transition is the best solution for the crisis in Syria. We support the letter and intent of the June 2012 Geneva Communiqué, June 30th, almost exactly a year ago, which calls for a transitional governing body with full executive powers and formed on the basis of national consent. We have been clear that there is no role for Assad in a transitional government. He has lost all credibility and must be held accountable for his crimes. Our efforts to strengthen the moderate opposition and change the balance on the ground include diplomatic outreach to improve the representativeness and connectedness of the opposition bodies themselves. We have repeatedly encouraged the political opposition to include grassroots activists from inside Syria, religious and ethnic minorities, and women from all these communities in their leadership. We hope that the upcoming meetings will produce more diverse and inclusive membership and leaders who reflect the diversity of Syrian society. We regularly track violations and abuses committed in Syria by all parties and regularly reiterate our call for all parties to the conflict to protect and to respect the rights of civilians regardless of ethnicity, religion, or gender. The international community must continue to support documentation and other efforts to lay the groundwork for justice and accountability processes, and to support Syrian efforts as they identify how best to bring to justice those who have committed so many heinous acts. As we expand our engagement with the Syrian opposition now, efforts by the United States and the international community focused on justice, accountability, and conflict resolution will be critical to ensuring the protection of human rights during Syria's transition. By helping Syrians to accelerate their efforts to lay the groundwork for eventual criminal trials, we aim to deter current and potential perpetrators of these crimes, as well as sectarian vigilante justice, or collective reprisals. In addition to our other bureaus and agencies in the U.S. government engaged in coordinated programs to assist Syrians over the past year or more, the State Department's Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor is supporting Syrian civil society so they can more effectively coordinate to advocate for human rights and democracy concerns. We're also bolstering efforts to lay the groundwork for future transitional justice initiatives by supporting the documentation of violations and abuses committed by all sides of the conflict, and education about locally owned accountability and transitional justice mechanisms. We're also promoting conflict mitigation and reconciliation efforts by supporting positive cross-sectarian engagement, coalition building, and targeted humanitarian assistance and conflict prevention training at the local level, working through respected NGOs and community leaders. We support these activities by partnering with large interfaith and ecumenical non-governmental international organizations and universities with experience in Syria. A broad range of Syrian ethnic and religious minority groups are included in these efforts. We have also honored the work of human rights activists such as Syrian Alawite activist Ms. Hanadi Zalut, who recently was selected for the 2013 Department of State Human Rights Defender Award. She has been active on human rights issues in Syria since before the revolution and was a founding member of the local coordination committees, which are an integral part of the opposition infrastructure. She is providing education and messaging on anti-sectarianism, as well as raising awareness about threats to the security of minority communities. Finally, to ensure that our assistance reaches its intended targets and does not end up in the hands of extremists, we will continue to vet recipients using the formal processes that have been established across various agencies. The United States stood with the Syrian people at the outset of this conflict, beginning with U.S. support for activists and civil society during the early protest movement. We stand with the Syrian people today with ongoing and increasing efforts to strengthen the opposition and civil society, and we will continue to stand with them going forward until the day that we can together welcome a new Syria, one where the Syrian people can enjoy a free, stable, and democratic country without Bashar al-Assad. We look forward to continuing to work with Congress toward this goal. Thank you again for this invitation to testify before your committees. I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Mr. Malia, thank you very much for your testimony and for the work of your office. I do have a few questions I'd like to pose, beginning first with, do we have any sense as to how many Christians, how many people of minority faiths have been killed, wounded, and put to flight, either as IDPs or as refugees?
We don't have hard numbers on that because a lot of the people that are gathering information about deaths, displacement, refugees, et cetera, don't always sort the numbers by religious affiliation. But we know the numbers are appalling and they're growing in all communities, including in the Christian minority.
In her testimony, is that something that if you can look into it even further, get back to us with some number, just so we know the order of magnitude, how many people have been killed or wounded?
We can certainly explore that. I'll see what we can find out about that.
That'd be very important to have.
Sure.
Let me, in her testimony, Nina Shea points out that, and I quote her in pertinent part, the Christians are not simply caught in the middle as collateral damage. They are the targets of a more focused shadow war, one that is taking place alongside the larger conflict between the Shiite-backed Ba'ath Assad regime and the largely Sunni rebel militias. Christians are the targets of an ethno-religious cleansing by Islamist militants and courts. Do you agree with that?
Well, I'm quite familiar with Ms. Shea's work over the years. I was a colleague of hers at Freedom House for a number of years, and I know she's one of the most astute students of this subject. I think she is right that the regime and other elements that have come into the country in the course of this conflict are targeting a number of the communities, including specifically Christian communities. So it's clear that the efforts to divide and conquer are affecting not only the Christians, but including the Christians, most definitely.
I'll never forget back in the early 1980s, a visit that I had to El Salvador when Napoleon Bonaparte was the Duarte, I should say, was the president of El Salvador, and there was a big raging controversy in the United States about whether or not human rights conditionality should be affixed to military aid. And in a meeting with Ambassador Kaur and myself, he said, while some in this government may say no, put those human rights safeguards on all of our aid, because it helps him even with some of those people who might have been part of the right-wing death squad apparatus that he abhorred himself. My question is that we now have taken a side, a clear side with the Free Syrian Army and with other elements of the opposition. And I'm wondering if you could tell us how we can ensure that our support, both in the area of weaponry and humanitarian support and logistical support, that we can ensure that the people to whom we are providing that are not part of the problem, are not committing atrocities and human rights abuses in Syria.
Well, you're pointing to one of the most difficult challenges that we've faced over these last many months, this conflict in figuring out how best to intervene in a constructive way. Because there are so many different militias and armed groups in various degrees of coordination with one another in the battle against the Assad regime. So that explains in significant part the hesitation to provide more to the opposition, to make sure that we don't provide more to the extremist elements that would work against our human rights values and against the longer-term interests of a free and stable Syria that we aspire to. In the assistance we've been providing, and this will certainly be enhanced as other kinds of assistance are provided, we will do our utmost to vet the recipients of that through the kinds of established mechanisms that we use to enforce other kinds of human rights provisions in our security and economic assistance. So we're engaged right now. It's very difficult when you don't have your established U.S. mechanisms in a country. We don't have an established order of battle in the opposition forces that we can study. The leadership doesn't control all of the armed elements on the ground. What I can assure you is that this is very much at the center of our deliberations. We're working very hard to figure out the best way to provide the kind of vetting and end-use monitoring that would ensure that the assistance we provide goes to the people who are working towards a free, stable, and democratic and rights-respecting Syria.
Mr. Chairman. Over here, Mr. Chairman, sorry.
Ms. Gunley.
Mr. Chairman, and I completely support your line of questioning. Are we on the 5-minute rule in terms
No,
of?
no, we're not.
May I?
You'll have as much time as you want to.
As much time as we want?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Within some reason. And that goes for me as well. Let me just ask a couple of other questions, and then I will yield to my colleagues. So when we're talking about promises and vetting, promises not to do ill or harm, how do we follow up with that? How do we actually ensure that once out in the field with weapons provided by the United States of America, that Christians and others are not being slaughtered? How do we do that?
Well, the many months of engagement and negotiation and political assistance that have been provided to the Syrian opposition by my colleagues who are on the front lines in that engagement. I know you've met with Ambassador Ford on many occasions. Others in our government are engaged on a constant basis with the Syrian political and military opposition. And this is exactly the kind of conversations we're having with them. They are endeavoring to persuade us that they have the command and control necessary to oversee the disposition of the equipment and assistance we provide. There's a trust building, there's a certain confidence building. We're going to have to also rely on the reports that we get from others, not only the people directly to whom we're assisting, but also the work of NGOs and journalists and others who are gathering all kinds of information. So we will be doing our utmost to gather as much real-time information as we can from as many sources as we can about what is happening on the ground in Syria. That all feeds into the database that we use to do further vetting. I wish I could promise you that there won't be any, wish I could promise you that we would be 100% successful in only sending assistance to the most high-minded, but we will certainly do our best to work with trusted people that we think share our values and our goals.
Does the Free Syrian Army understand that if they commit atrocities, if they rape and kill and execute Christians or anyone else for that matter, that U.S. funding ceases?
again, this has been very much a part of our conversation, and they have made statements, and we know that they have told their people in the field to adhere to the international standards of humanitarian law and the laws of war and conflict. It's not a highly organized military organization, but it's one that, as we engage with all Syrian organizations, this is very much a part of our discourse with them. They know why we're there. We are there to support a transition to a democratic, rights-respecting regime in Syria, and any of the kind of behavior you're describing moves it in the opposite direction, and we can't support that.
Now, one final question. With regards to chain of command, are our military advisors and the administration have they been sufficiently assured that the chain of command, what the general says, follows through to the colonel, to the lieutenants, right on down to the private, or does that kind of structure simply not exist, making, again, any kind of discipline when it comes to human rights that much harder to adhere to?
I'm going to defer to my colleagues at the Pentagon and elsewhere who are more directly in that lane of responsibility for the details on how that happens. But all I can say is that this is very much a part of our policy, and I can assure you that in our near-daily interagency meetings on this is not ever out of the discussion.
I do have a final question. If you had the opposition versus the Assad military, how would the breakdown in human rights, is it 60-40, 80-20? Who are committing the lion's share of these atrocities?
The regime of Bashar al-Assad is by far responsible for the most crimes against humanity, the most murders, the most dislocation of people in Syria. That's an easy one.
Okay.
It's a painful one, but it's easy to say. And we have been mindful, and the leadership, the responsible leadership in the Syrian opposition has been mindful of the arrival of extremists who've come in and say that they're fighting the same battle but have different agendas. And trying to separate them out is part of their job and part of our job, to make sure that the extremist elements do not benefit from our assistance.
Had we done this months ago, would it have made a difference? Or is it, I mean, Secretary Kerry himself said we're late. Are we late?
I'll leave it at what Secretary Kerry said. Question is, what do we do tomorrow?
Okay. With regards to chain of command, I do hope you would take that back. You know, I've chaired hearings and I've been around the world many times, even looking at UN peacekeepers who have a very rigid chain of command, and yet in places like DR Congo, it was the peacekeepers who were raping 13-year-olds, which became, as you know, a horrific scandal. And here we have people that aren't even part of an organized military, so it raises very serious questions. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, and thank you for your testimony. I want to touch a little bit. We were talking about the militias and the effectiveness of vetting. Do you have a sense of how many militias are currently active in Syria?
I think different parts of our government have studied this and come up with numbers that grow over time.
But ballpark, is it?
Scores.
Scores. So, you know, more than 40, approaching 60.
Scores.
Of those militias, any sense of how many of them are affiliated with specific sects or religious groups versus how many are coming in from the outside or coming in with a different agenda?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know that as the violence goes on, we see increasingly that different communities, geographic communities, religious, ethnic communities, are feeling increasingly obliged to organize themselves and defend their communities. And that leads to the proliferation of militias and different centers of military activity, defensive and then conflictive.
Let me come back to that in a second. As far as looking at these scores of militias, how are we planning to evaluate who's moderate and who's not?
That's the vetting process that I referred to, that the State Department and other agencies will go into, but I'd rather leave that for another venue to talk in more detail about that.
What are examples of maybe some definitions of what makes one group moderate versus a different group?
I guess it depends on what they say their goals are, and then also how they behave. Stated goals and behavior, I think, would tell you what different groups' orientations are. And so that's, so I would leave it at that.
One of the concerns I have, and I had a chance to meet a woman actually at a naturalization ceremony on Friday, a brand new American from Syria, from the western part of Syria, and she was relating a story of how her brother was lost vision in one eye. He's now in Turkey getting medical treatment, but expressing her concern. There was someone else who was talking about the challenges. I guess there's a significant Armenian community in Syria and what they see as post-Assad, and you have different opinions on different sides of the outcome. The split, and I'll go to the percentage split within the population. What percent of people within the minority groups are fearful that if the Assad regime falls, they would be targets of retaliation?
I don't have a number answer for you, Congressman, but I can say that anticipating that there would be an instinct for some kind of vengeance against minority communities has been part of our political diplomatic assistance engagement from the start to warn against, urge against any kind of vengeance and retributive violence. So that's, again, as I say, this has been very much a part of our conversation inside the government here and with our Syrian partners from day one, because that's a downward cycle that can only make things worse. So we have been, you're describing exactly the challenge we face.
So one of my fears as we look at it is, and you use the word retribution or retributive justice, I'll call, for lack of a better term, antiquated perspectives on justice. We're looking for people who have a more enlightened vision of justice that can look at the past but focus on the future. Do you have a sense that there are enough people within Syria across the spectrum of different sects that we can work with and actually try to achieve an enlightened system of justice in a new Syria?
We know there are people that are working towards that and would like to see a system of rights-based respect for the rule of law in Syria. Some of them, interestingly, are judges and other parts of the judicial system that have defected from the Assad regime and would like to be judges and prosecutors in a better Syria. We know that there are people who have been in opposition in human rights groups and elsewhere for a long time who also see a vision for a rights-respecting system in Syria based on international standards and norms. So we know the people are there. And those are the people that we're trying to support through our assistance efforts and our technical advisory assistance efforts.
As we engage, as we look forward, find groups that will share our values and vision, best case scenario, how likely do you think our prospects for success are?
I think the success of the Syrian transition will depend mainly on the people of Syria and how they organize themselves and where they push their leaders and where their leaders take them. You know, we're playing, along with a number of other international partners, an important supporting role. But I think it's important always to keep in mind that this is not so much about us as it's about Syrians. And if we can support people to move it in the right direction, we can do that. And that's what we're engaged in trying to do now.
And my last questions or line of questions, you touched on it a little bit. In the cities, in Aleppo and Damascus, where you have large cosmopolitan areas, where you have different religious groups living together, and for a long time, as you said in your opening remarks, living in peace. That's one situation. But in the villages, where, as you mentioned, now entire villages, which would tend to be more of one faith or another, organizing and unifying. I had a chance to observe a battle from just across the border between Druze, in a Druze village, surrounded by Sunnis, and it's a real concern. Are the villages going to be able to engage in a future Syria, or are they going to carry these grudges, and we're going to see a intense or intensifying sectarian warfare after the fall of the Assad regime?
Our efforts in engaging with the political opposition have been to encourage and cajole and persuade them to make their political apparatus as inclusive and representative of Syrian diversity as possible. That will continue to be our effort. We will continue to try to push them in that direction. And, you know, as we've seen in war-torn societies around the world, that's one of the most difficult things afterwards when conflicts have broken down along ethnic, sectarian, religious, linguistic lines. Try to patch back together diverse communities. That will be a long road to hoe for Syria, and we'll endeavor to work with them to find peace-building mechanisms, cross-community efforts at reconciliation. And right now, we're focusing on trying to strengthen a political opposition that will provide a better model for a way forward for Syria, to get them to the negotiating table and to help them articulate a vision for an inclusive, democratic, rights-respecting Syria.
If the road diverges and we end up in a failed state in Syria, what geographies do you see? Do you see it fracturing into multiple sectarian districts, or is it a complete failed state?
Well, now you're getting into speculating about what's the worst thing that could possibly happen. So I'm going to not take
Fair
the
enough.
bait and decline to go that way.
I understand. Thank you for your responses. I yield back.
Mr. Weber?
Mr. Malia, you are the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy and Human Rights and Labor. Is that right?
That's right, sir.
How long have you been doing that?
3 years.
3 years. You enjoying that job? I hate to put you on the spot, but I'm going to put you on the spot.
It's a terrific opportunity to serve my country in an important role in the government. I get to work with colleagues across Europe and the Middle East to try to integrate human rights considerations into our broader foreign policy. It's a terrific opportunity for a guy like me.
Well, you sound like a politician. See what you run. Well, watch your career and see what you run for next. So you were there on August the 21st, 2012. Your 3 years would have predated that, according to the Associated Press release, when President Obama said that if chemical weapons were used in Syria, that was a red line that would be crossed, and the United States would take action. Do you recollect that?
I do.
Okay.
We've been reminded of that a number of times since.
I would imagine. According to the AP article, some 20,000 people at that point, after a year and a half of struggle, had lost their lives. Does that strike you as correct, reasonable estimate back then?
Yeah, I can't challenge that. I don't remember the dates,
Okay.
numbers, but
Well, I'll tell you what my wife tells me. I wasn't looking for a challenge, okay? Now to date, what is that number to date? What do we estimate? How many people have lost their lives?
in Syria, it's the United Nations has reported it's above 93,000, and others say it's over 100,000.
Would you calculate the time from August the 21st, 2012 to date for me, please? How long has that been? August 20?
That's 11 months.
11 months.
Close to 11 months.
A little less than 11 months. You made the comment that you wish you could promise we would be 100% successful in only sending weapons to the quote, most high-minded in earlier testimony here today. How do you decide who's the most high-minded?
I'm going to leave the discussion for whatever expanded assistance is being provided to the Syrian opposition for others at a higher pay grade. I'm trying to describe for you, Congressman, the efforts that we're making to ensure that whatever assistance we provide is accompanied by a strong emphasis on respect for the international humanitarian law and the rules of war, and democratic standards for addressing human rights violations.
So it was 20,000 people on August the 21st, 2012 that had lost their lives, and now it's, what'd you say, almost 90,000? So we're going to leave that to other people to make a decision. How's that working for those 70,000 people that have since lost their lives? It's not working, is it? We have got to have action on our part, wouldn't you say?
Congressman, the President of the United States, 2 Secretaries of State, 2 Secretaries of Defense have been focused on this on a daily basis. We are working to support the Syrian people to move to a post-Assad situation. This is one of the highest priorities of this government. We're doing it mindful of all of the complexities that Congressman Smith, Congressman Schneider described for us earlier. And we have, as you noted, the President's spokesman said a couple weeks ago that red line on the chemical weapons use has been crossed, and that we're broadening the nature of our assistance to the Syrian opposition. So we're moving in that direction.
You said that in earlier testimony here today that the regime of Assad had by far committed the most crimes against humanity. Would you give us a percentage of that? Are they committing 60%, 70% of what you're seeing on the ground, 90%? Would you attribute a number to that for us?
I've seen different estimates from different agencies, humanitarian, journalists, et cetera. It's by far, it's in the 80, 90% or more are responsible.
So of the 90,000 people killed who have lost their lives in this, you would say that some 80,000 are attributable to the Assad regime? And I realize that's a guess, okay. Do you think the lack of action on our part, let me say it this way, and you work at the State Department. That's why I was curious about your title and how long you'd been there. Mark Twain said that a committee is a group of individuals who by themselves can do nothing, but collectively they can decide that nothing can be done. And my fear is that we've got a situation where we go over there, and I'm not attacking you personally, but we look at what's going on and we make all these grandiose observations and these declarations that would be a red line crossed. And then we decide that nothing can be done. And we sit back and we wait. And more people lose their lives. Is that what's going on in the State Department?
I think that's an incorrect description to say that nothing has been done since then or nothing is being done today. We're providing close to $1 billion worth of assistance to Syrians, displaced persons, and refugees in neighboring countries. We're providing a range of assistance. I described just some of it in terms of political advisory assistance to the political opposition at a national level and to local councils around the country in the liberated areas. We are providing support for their efforts to rebuild and sustain the infrastructure of Syria in the liberated areas. To say that nothing is being done, I think, is just not accurate.
So then it's your contention here today that, based on your earlier comments, you want to vet 100%, well, you can't guarantee 100%, but you want to vet people who are the highest minded, and you want to get involved and you want to help, but yet that's how you do that, how you decide who's the highest minded is above your pay grade. Whose pay grade is that?
Well, we have a number of professionals in the government that we do this all the time on different kinds of assistance programs. And maybe I'll rephrase the high-mindedness to say what we're looking to do is exclude violators of human rights. We're looking to make sure that our assistance, again, consistent with the comments and questions from your colleagues, don't inadvertently go to people that are going to commit human rights violations with our assistance. We are there to strengthen those people that are committed to building a democratic, rights-respecting Syria.
Do we have a good track record in doing that?
I think if you look around the world, I think we've often been able to help people do the right thing and strengthen institutions of
For example, Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. Let me change gears a little bit on you. When the President makes a statement that chemical weapons, the use of chemical weapons is a red line that's crossed, will be a game changer. In fact, he said, let me quote from the article here, the President noted that he had an order, that's an issue that doesn't just concern Syria. It concerns our close allies in the region, including Israel. It concerns us. Obama said, underscoring that the U.S. wouldn't accept the threat of weapons of mass destruction from Syrian President Bashar Assad's government, rebels fighting the government, or militant groups aiding either side. AP quoted him, "We cannot have a situation where chemical or biological weapons are falling into the hands of the wrong people." Article went on to say that the President noted that he hadn't ordered any armed U.S. intervention yet, but said, quote, "We have communicated in no uncertain terms with every player in the region that that's a red line for us, and there would be enormous consequences if we start seeing movement on the chemical weapons front or the use of chemical weapons. That would change my calculations significantly," he said, end quote, August 21st, 2012. And yet 70,000 more people have died. Are we losing credibility in the world?
No. In fact, this administration has reestablished American credibility in quite a remarkable way. So I think that to say that
That's why Russia and China have sent back, what's his face? That's why they extradited him to our country?
how many subjects do you want to go over, Mr.
Edward
Chairman?
Snowden. Well, I'm simply saying that as a supervisor in the State Department, at what point do you say to those who are that higher pay grade, we're not getting the job done and we need to change? At what point how many more people have to lose their lives before that message gets communicated upline?
You quoted the President. The President's spokesman followed up on that in his, Ben Rhodes, in the statement he made 2 weeks ago on Thursday. When the evidence came in that the red line had been crossed, decisions have been taken, and we're moving forward.
Well, then, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back, but I have a suggestion for a future hearing. Maybe we get people with a higher pay grade in here to testify and answer those questions as to what it takes to get to that process. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Connolly.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I'd love to have a hearing where members of Congress actually have to explain themselves in terms of what it is they want the United States to do. Are you willing to go to war again? Are you willing to put troops on the ground if it doesn't work out? Do you have omniscience? Do you know who's good and who's bad in Syria? Because unless you do, I don't think you're in a position to lecture this administration about the options it has and the options it's exercised. This country is sick of war and does not want to be sucked into another one. Mr. Melia.
Congressman?
Help me understand how we are supposed to, the title of this hearing is Religious Minorities in Syria Caught in the Middle. You think that's a fair description of religious minorities in Syria?
I think that's not an unreasonable description. The religious minorities, of course, are disparate, not all of like mind or like situation, but they're in a very difficult place, not least because for the last several decades they've lived in a very repressive country where the government has squelched the ability of people to interact normally between communities, within their communities. This country is emerging in fits and starts from decades of repressive totalitarian rule. That means that it's hard for people to build trust and confidence across communities. It's hard for them to think about how to build a better future. But it's beginning to happen now. There are Syrians that are coming out and building these bridges, and we're trying to support that.
A little bit of history. When Hafez Assad came to power, he championed the cause and was himself a member of a particular sect, not fully accepted as even Islamic by some, the Alawite sect. Is that correct?
That's right.
And in championing their cause, did he also champion the cause of other minorities in Syria at the time, or purport to?
I'll defer to the knowledgeable congressman on the strategies and policies of Hafez al-Assad.
But you're looking at human rights. You knew what the title of this hearing was, so I'm trying to explore with you a little bit of history to put things in context.
Right.
If you were a Christian Syrian and a minority Alawite government comes to power initially, you feel better or worse about the protection of your rights as a minority within Syria at the time?
One might think that minorities would be better treated if the government was led by a person from a minority community.
Could there be rational reason to be concerned, if you were a minority at that time, about, in a sense, the tyranny of the majority?
Absolutely.
Are there historical reasons, not only in Syria but in the region, to find that concern not entirely irrational?
Absolutely. It's a common dilemma across the region and indeed worldwide that minorities feel sometimes at the mercy of majority communities that they may be alienated from, yes.
So I like the title of this hearing, Mr. Chairman, because I think it actually accurately captures the ambiguity, the mixed feelings one might have if one were a member of a religious minority in terms of the current situation in Syria. If we had an insurgency that explicitly embraced, and within reason it could be confirmed, diversity, protection of minority rights, and the composition of which was itself very diverse, and explicitly reassuring the minorities in Syria their rights would be better protected than they had been in the current brutal regime, I assume, Mr. Miller, that would make your job a little easier.
Well, it would, and that's been our quest, is to encourage the opposition, the civilian opposition to Assad, to work in precisely that direction, to articulate, and they have in some significant ways, a vision that is inclusive of diversity, of religious and ethnic diversity in Syria. The challenge is going to be to help them make that real. We've encouraged them to include in the leadership of the Syrian opposition a diverse set of individuals representing the many different communities, including women. They haven't always taken our advice, but it remains part of our encouragement to them. So we're trying to encourage them to work in precisely the direction you described, Congressman.
Is it your impression that we have made headway in that regard so that the leadership of the opposition, the armed opposition, is better sensitized and itself more diverse than it was at the time of the uprising?
We've made some headway, but not enough.
Is there evidence within Syria that minorities are responding to the call of the armed opposition and abandoning the Assad regime?
Well, let me also emphasize that there's the political opposition, which is affiliated to the armed opposition, but which is distinct. And our efforts on working with Syrians to build out their vision for a political future for the country are concentrated mainly with civilian leaders. That's the group that Ambassador Ford and Assistant Secretary Jones and Undersecretary Sherman have been engaged with over many weeks to try to encourage them to come together and create a coherent political organization that, among other things, could go to a conference in Geneva and negotiate the future of Syria and to provide the beginnings of governance in Syria. At the same time, there are these local councils that have emerged in various parts of liberated Syria with their own elections, their own dynamics. There's a different group of leaders that are emerging there. And then there is the broad swath of independent civil society, men and women and their families who are not literally part of the opposition per se, not part of the military opposition, maybe not part of the political opposition, but who would like to live in a better Syria. And that civil society is also another object of our attention, to try to help them build out, if you will, nonpartisan, institutional-oriented projects for building towards a democratic Syria.
Well, I was in Egypt before the revolution and after the revolution, and many of the same arguments could have been used about Egypt during the revolution. And it's a similar dynamic where, because there was no political space allowed for a long period of time, only that which was organized underground and organized well is going to benefit from the vacuum created by the revolution. And so there were lots of secular advocates for civil society, for pluralistic society, respect for minority rights, who showed up at Tahrir Square and elsewhere, and they were essentially brushed aside when the political process got underway by the only organized opposition group in the country, the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's a work in progress, and the jury's out, but there are a lot of alarming signs that it's not a desirable outcome. And we did get early behind the ouster of Mubarak. We didn't get involved militarily, but we certainly put our chits in the line very early in Egypt. And one could argue that that's an outcome that certainly is a source of concern at this moment. This committee had a hearing just last week about the judgment with respect to NGO employees. and we have expressed concern about democratization and so forth. And so I guess my concern is that the choices here are not easy, though some would have us believe they are, and that those who want us to intervene aggressively, as if it's a black and white situation, the good guys all wear white hats and the bad guys all wear black ones, will have to explain when and if, God forbid, the outcomes are not to our liking. I do not believe that the choices in Syria are all that clear. I wish they were. I do agree, of course, that the administration, the regime of Bashar Assad must go. But we're going to have to work very carefully to make sure that that which replaces it is a government that respects the rights of minorities, including religious minorities. I am very grateful you've had this hearing, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Kinzer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll start with a real quick quote from Winston Churchill. He says, "You have enemies, good. That means you've stood up for something sometime in your life." I believe that in what I've seen lately in this administration, to be honest with you, we're out to make friends with everybody. I think it was mentioned earlier what's going on with the man who stole, the 29-year-old who basically decided he was going to take it upon himself to determine U.S. foreign policy and is now being held by, I guess, the Russians. And there's this kind of carnival going on, and some people call him a hero. I tend to think he's a traitor, but that said, we don't really know, I think, where the administration stands on a lot of issues. The administration came in, they said they wanted a great reset with Russia. Unfortunately, I don't think Russia got that information. We disarmed our ability to defend ourselves against attacks to the chagrin of our allies, and the Russians responded by increasing their nuclear arsenal. The gentleman that spoke before me said something about yelling in terms of, we don't know where we want to go. Do we know who the enemy is? Do we know what exactly goals we need to achieve in Syria? And the answer is no, we don't. And the reason is because for the last 2 years, I have not heard this administration sell those goals to the American people. The leader of the free world is not the United States Congress. The leader of the free world is the President of the United States. Everywhere from 2009, where there was an uprising in Iran, utter silence, crickets on the side of the administration, to this situation in Syria where we saw Bashar al-Assad initially being challenged by people that wanted freedom from a dictatorship, and we got crickets from this administration. And now we've created ourselves, we put ourselves in a situation where the opposition does have al-Qaeda influence, and the opposition does have extremist influence. And the opposition now is much more muddled because there has not been American leadership. And sir, and I say this respectfully because I understand you're here as kind of the face of the administration. You're not the one necessarily making these decisions. That was made clear. But a big question I have is, where has the administration been in terms of selling this to the American people? And if we have been as active as you say, then how come we on this committee have talked to allies that have told us they're begging for United States leadership to bring these groups together? I won't necessarily out who's saying that, but I will say allies have talked to us and said, we need American leadership in this. So if you'd care to elaborate on exactly what we're doing in bringing allies together and taking a prime role in solving this situation, I'll give you a short opportunity to do that.
Well, let me just, I'm not sure I can respond to all the points you raised, Congressman.
I don't expect you to, no worries.
Let me simply say that we're engaged constantly. Secretary Kerry is on the phone and in the room with our allies in Europe. And
well, and I understand he wants to bring the Russians together, and the Russians have made very clear that they have a very different interest, and if they come together and talk to us, it's probably to buy some time. It's not going to be because we're going to enlighten them with our philosophy, and they will want to have freedom in Syria. Go ahead.
So the United States, currently in the person of Secretary Kerry, is on a daily basis engaged with our friends and allies in Europe and across the Middle East on bringing them together around Syria and utilizing everybody's points of access to try to bring people to the table, as well as to organize effective humanitarian and other support to the Syrian opposition. So I don't know who you've heard from among our allies that says we're not leading this, but They certainly come to the meetings we convene, and
I
there's
think
a
that's
coordinated effort underway, and I think we're leading it.
That's the point. In Congress, I've been in Congress for 2.5 years now, and I've learned something, and that is there are plenty of meetings, but little action. And so bringing people to meetings, and again, I say this understanding you're not the one leading this, so this isn't a personal attack, but you're the face of the administration today. I think leading meetings isn't necessarily going to solve a situation where you have 90,000 people, vast majority of them innocent, that have lost their lives. It was also said earlier, America is sick and tired of war. I get it. America's tired. We are. As a military pilot and somebody that's been to a bunch of theaters in that capacity and still in the military, I can tell you we'd love all this war to go away. But we live in a moment in time right now where history in 50 or 100 years is going to judge what we did in this epic shift in what America and the world looks like. This is not the time to be fatigued. This is not the time for America to say, well, yeah, we get it, Iraq didn't go exactly as we had planned. Afghanistan's been a lot longer than we had planned. I feel like the administration's in a hurry to get out of Afghanistan on an artificial timeline, but that's a separate subject. This is not the moment where America can say, we don't have the luxury to say, we're a little fatigued, it's time to just move on. Because in 50 or 100 years, the history books that our kids and grandkids read is going to say, what did America do during this time when there was a monumental shift? And it will either be a monumental shift towards a, Russian, Chinese-centric world, a monumental shift towards extremism, a monumental shift towards chaos, or it could be a monumental shift where America seized an opportunity and led the charge of freedom around the globe. One of the verses of the Star-Spangled Banner actually has a great line that unfortunately doesn't get said very much. It's, "Oh, conquer we must when our cause it is just." And that's something that I think we ought not to forget. And one other thing I want to chat with you about. You mentioned that this administration has reestablished credibility around the globe. Reestablished credibility around the globe. I'd like to I'll give you an opportunity to elaborate on that, sir.
I'm tempted to try to cover the waterfront as you have, Congressman. There's obviously a rich discussion to be had.
Yeah, unfortunately, I control the time, though. So just if you could go on with reestablishing credibility, that's what I'm curious about.
Well, I'll just give you one example, which is that this administration made the decision to become much more active in the international arenas of the United Nations, the UN Human Rights Council, the OSCE, where we have come to play a leadership role galvanizing these international mechanisms to articulate and enhance the norms that reflect our values: freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of religion. And there's a number of ways in which we have led the international community in these venues to step up and agree with our propositions that these fundamental international human rights are the international system's standards. So that happens through patient diplomacy, engaging with a wide range of countries, and we have the credibility to do that. We lead these discussions, and we often get them to a good result. Not 100% of the time, but often when we engage, we succeed.
Unfortunately, though, sometimes if you don't back that with strength and, saying, as was mentioned earlier by Mr. Weber, talking about a red line, I've said before, if you're in a crowded theater, and the only way to empty that crowded theater is if you yell the word red line, don't do it, because it has a very powerful meaning if you're president of the United States. Sir, with that, I'll yield back. I want to say I do respect your work for your country, and I appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kissinger. Just a few follow questions, and if Mr. Connolly or any other member of the panel has any additional questions, I hope they'll fire away. Let me just ask you, if I could, Dr. Jasser will testify later today that the Assyrian International News Agency recently reported that armed rebels affiliated with the Free Syrian Army raided the Christian-populated El Duva village and massacred all of its civilian residents, including women and children. Are you aware of this report? Was it investigated by the State Department? And did it show the Free Syrian Army responsible? And how are those battalions, how are those troops being held to account?
I confess that I don't know the details on that specific incident. I'd be glad to take the question if that's all right and come back to you
I appreciate that.
in writing
You get
or
back to
another
us as
briefing.
soon as you can.
Okay.
Dr. Eibner, who will also testify, has just returned from Syria, and he says the very existence of religious minorities in the Middle East are under threat. What is happening to Christians is genocide. And matter of fact, earlier they had put out a genocide alert. And I'm wondering if you agree that this is a genocide.
Our government has not come to the use of the word genocide at this point. We just talk about crimes against humanity, and there's certainly some many gross human rights violations. The word genocide is fraught with legal and moral and political meaning. I wouldn't toss it around casually. I know it's an important part of this discussion. I just would say that we're not there yet, but I think it's certainly a worthy discussion.
Well, as you know, the very Genocide Convention talks about in whole or in part. It would seem with the evaporating, as Dr. Eidner says, the very existence of religious minorities in the Middle East are under threat. This is the ultimate game changer. People are not only being slaughtered, they're leaving. And so I would hope you would take that back. And I would agree that it does carry with it implications in law, but I think that's a good thing. I remember the fight we had with Sudan in trying to get Sudan and the horrific killings in Darfur designated as a genocide, and the reluctance was appalling on the part of so many, including our friends in the European community. So, and we were there as well. So please take that back, because I do think we need to call it for what it is: the systematic elimination of people because of their beliefs in whole or in part. If that's not happening in Syria, I don't know what is. You mentioned also about the importance of documenting the atrocities, and I couldn't agree more. I do hope, though, that the documentation is thorough, that people on every side of the divide who are committing atrocities are held to account. But I would also say I think it is thoughtful, but I don't think it comports with the reality that somehow Assad or others on the Free Syrian Army side really take the idea that they will be held to account someday all that seriously. Milosevic never did. Charles Taylor did not. Karadzic and all the others who systematically slaughtered people after the fact, after the wars were over, then they realized that they were in a heap of trouble. But it's important we document. But I'm wondering, how much resources do we spend on that? And are we going just for the higher-ups? Because we saw with the Yugoslav court, the Sierra Leone court, the Rwandan court, very often the very people who were the ones who pulled the trigger and mowed people down and raped horribly were not the ones held to account. So I'm wondering how far down the line of responsibility we will be going.
Well, there's different efforts underway through non-governmental organizations to collect and organize the information. Our Bureau is supporting one major effort in that regard, but there are others. Syrians in exile, working with Syrians in the country. I don't know that I can... The documentation is inclusive and far-reaching. It's not looking at people at a certain grade or rank. It's looking at incidents and then trying to connect the dots about who might be responsible.
But in the past, as you know, and I know you know this so well, having a background that is very rich in human rights work, the colonels and the other people who commit these atrocities are often not held to account. It is the very top, and for that matter, very few at the very top.
Well, the documentation efforts are as comprehensive as they can be. Decisions will be made later by Syrians in the first instance, and then perhaps by other bodies about what the accountability might be and for who and in what
And would this be something that would be brought at the ICC, or is it something, a special court that might be established? What's the venue?
We haven't gotten there yet. We're just gathering the information for whatever venue might make use of it later on.
Several years back, I held the only and one of the most contentious hearings I've ever held on the Armenian genocide. And we had both sides, the Turks and the Armenians on both sides of the divide there at the table, the witness table. But now, fast forward to now, and the fact that some 100,000 Armenians have fled, are there any special efforts being made to reach out to that community, as well as others, to help them with their refugee status?
You know, that's a good question, Congressman. I don't have a concrete answer for you, but I'd be glad to look into what our engagement has been with the Armenian community. I know we have met with leaders of the Armenian Church and some of the members of the ethnic community. So I know it's part of our engagement. I just don't have a specific answer for you on whether we've done something in particular for that community per se.
Very shortly, we'll be marking up a piece of legislation introduced by Congressman Frank Wolf that focuses on, it would establish a special envoy for Middle East religions. Obviously, he began to think, and I'm a co-sponsor of it and proud to be so, how important it is that someone walk point on these Christians who are being, as Dr. Eibner said, their very existence is under threat. Very existence. Does the administration support the Wolf bill?
We do not. We think that the Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom and the staff of the International Religious Freedom Office is able to address these issues, and we don't need an additional envoy at this point.
With all due respect, I hope you'll convey to your superiors how disappointing that is, because it seems to me that there are religious persecutions occurring all over the world. China is probably among the worst. The Ambassador at Large, which was Wolf's bill as well, went through my committee. We did all the heavy lifting on it in this committee. Is one person. It's an office, of course, but it seems to me that a special envoy with a singular focus would have, at least with the ear of the President, would have additional clout to really convey, including to the Free Syrian Army, how serious we are about hands-off those people who are at risk, including the Christians. So I would hope you would take that back. We had the same fight, as you know, with the Special Envoy for Sudan, and it took a long time, but we finally got it. But I hope you'll take that back, that we're disappointed. Mr. Connolly?
I'll bring it back to my superiors.
Oh, I see. Please, Mr. Gilham.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. It seems like when I was here, you answered pretty much everything that was asked over and over again, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but what I see in the Middle East, it seems like a broken record with the policies that we've had and the same conflicts that come up. And I read, too, that article you read about, or referenced about the 15-year-old boy that was assassinated in front of his parents. And my concern is like everybody's else. To give military assistance to these groups, even if we vet them, you know, there's no guarantee that somebody else will come in and take those arms away. And from your experience, what other non-intervention techniques, strategies can we come up with, and how can we include more Arab nations involved in this? Because as we all know, if Westerners intervene in an Islamic state, it tends to unify against the Westerners. So what else could we do instead of military assistance to help stop this? Can we employ and engage the UN more, since that was one of their main missions, is to help resolve world conflicts, and it doesn't seem like we're doing very well there either. And from your experience in the years you've had in foreign affairs around the world, what other strategy could we come up with? I mean, there's got to be a better way instead of sending arms over there, because we tried that in I mean, even our own administration sending them to Mexico, we couldn't keep track of them. And I don't know how we can keep track of them in a foreign nation. So if you could elaborate real briefly.
Well, we have been engaged since long before this uprising and conflict began in isolating the Syrian regime through financial sanctions and political sanctions. And that's been escalated over these last 2 years through a series of measures that we've implemented, so that the financial and economic assistance to the Syrian regime has been reduced dramatically thanks to American leadership in mobilizing the international community on this sanctions regime. The conference that Secretary Kerry has proposed, along with Foreign Minister Lavrov, to bring together the different sides in Syria is to be convened, in fact, by the United Nations. I mean, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who would convene that conference. So although the initiative has come from the U.S. and Russian foreign ministers, it is intended, is envisioned to be managed by the United Nations. So we have been mobilizing the international community in a variety of ways to provide, to try to cut off the assistance to the regime and also to facilitate a discussion. As you well know, the Russian and Chinese governments have not cooperated in our efforts to bring greater Security Council weight to these decisions on Syria, and we know that several countries are continuing to supply weapons to the Syrian government, and That's feeding the problem. That's fueling the problem.
It is, and I agree, and that's the broken record I see over and over again. What other Arabian or Arab countries are we bringing to the table that have a vested interest? I know Jordan's right there, and we got Turkey to the north. I mean, how else can we engage them and make a stronger presence to where the influence is coming from them to say, let's calm this down, let's develop our economies and not worry about this other stuff, and help that situation in that form instead of here's your guns, here's your military aid, and it just doesn't seem like that works. Who else is coming to the table?
Well, the Arab League, which is the 22-member organization in which Syria had been a member for many years, initially was divided over this. They expelled the Syrian regime, and most of the Arab governments of the Arab League are increasingly visibly on the side of the opposition in various ways. And so they have seen this as a problem that they would like to see resolved sooner rather than later. And they're very much a part of this multilateral engagement. That Secretary Kerry he was in Saudi Arabia today. He was in Bahrain recently. I mean, he is constantly engaging with our Arab friends on this question as well as with the Europeans.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to yield back. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a few brief items. One, I think you made a statement, you've been asked about twice, about the restoration of U.S. prestige and engagement around the world. One presumes by your saying that there was something to be restored. There was prestige to be restored. Was that your point?
I think I'm going to resist the temptation to get into an analysis of the previous administration's foreign policy. I just don't think it would be productive for today's hearing. With all due respect, Congressman.
Fine. I will not show such restraint. I mean, it is very clear that the United States' prestige and engagement around the world were badly damaged by 8 years of the previous administration. We can hold in abeyance whether what they decided to do was good, bad, or indifferent, but what is beyond dispute is it was controversial, unwelcome in the international community, and did us damage with allies and neutral nations alike. And enormous repair work had to be done. And that's one of the reasons why the former Secretary, Hillary Clinton, spent so much time traveling. She wanted to repair face-to-face damaged relationships in every continent on the planet. So the idea that somehow our prestige is on the line because we haven't invaded Syria or made a clear-cut decision about who to support in Syria, I find ironic at best. So I'll say it for you. I thought the Chairman made a very important point about atrocities and war crimes. And if I took what you were getting at, Mr. Smith, by documenting them now, by making sure that those perpetrating those crimes are fully aware of the fact we're doing that, and that sooner or later they will be brought to justice, it seems to me could help on lots of levels, not least of which is perhaps helping to deter some of the atrocities. Though, as Mr. Weber points out, 90,000, 93,000 is a horrific number for a country the size of Syria. What are we doing to track atrocities and to advertise broadly that we're doing so and we're naming names?
Well, the efforts that we're supporting currently are not broadcasting names now, but I think it is increasingly well known in Syria because there's researchers and data collectors working online and through collecting interviews from refugees and survivors of different incidents. There's a lot of, it's clear that there's a lot of information being gathered, and while we don't want to endanger the ongoing effort to collect the information, the purpose of the work is precisely as you say, Congressman, to let people know that there will be some accountability and that we hope that at some points some individuals, some others will choose the better path, knowing that there will be some accountability down the road. So that's the purpose of this.
Well, you know, they say sunshine is the best disinfectant, and I think I concur with the chairman's, I think where you were taking us, which is bringing some sunshine onto this may go a long way. But at the very least, everyone needs to be on notice. We will pursue it, as will the international community. Finally, the word genocide, you reacted to the word genocide. And would you say, given your responsibilities, that it would be a fair characterization to say that religious minorities, including especially the Christian community, but not limited to the Christian community, in the Middle East and certainly in Syria, have reason to be concerned?
Absolutely. I think it's very clear that religious tensions and violence have risen across the region. I think that's indisputable. Very, very clear reasons to be concerned.
Would it be fair to say that policies, explicit or implicit, that have been adopted in the region, especially in the post-Arab Spring governments, are encouraging religious minorities, especially Christians, to perhaps find a different home, to go somewhere else, to not be integrated into this new community, this new political community? Is that a fair statement?
You're describing the ongoing political, social challenges of these countries in which new political actors, new governments are changing some of the dynamics, some of the protections that may have previously existed for minority communities. You're describing the challenges we face in the region, but more importantly, that the people of the region face. And so this is an important issue and worthy of greater discussion and examination.
I share the chairman's concern about the fate of so many minority communities in the region. I can tell you when I go, Mr. Schneider was talking about going to a naturalization ceremony. I go to as many as I can in my district, and some of them are very substantial, 700, 800 new citizens. What has struck me in the last year or so was the upsurge in the number of Christian Egyptians and Christian Syrians who are coming to the United States for citizenship because of their palpable fear of remaining back home. Now, that may be anecdotal. It may just be those families. But the numbers certainly grab one, and I just think it's really important. I don't know that genocide is going on, though we are going to have a witness who will assert otherwise. But certainly some kind of cleansing seems to be going on in certain quarters of the region, and it is very troubling. And it seems to me that the United States must speak out about that and without doing something ham-handed, try to offer its protection to those minority communities. A delicate job, but it seems to me that is something incumbent upon us as we move forward. A value you would share, Mr. Miller?
I agree with you, Congressman.
Finally, Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank Mr. Miller for being here. He and I go way back. We worked on the Hill together in the United States Senate. He worked as a foreign policy he was the foreign policy legislative assistant to the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. I was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff, and Tom did a great job then and is doing a great job for his country now. Thank you, Mr. Miller, for being here.
Thank you, Congressman.
Ms. Webb. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Milliet. And I do, there are a number of questions that you did say you would get back on, and I hope you'll do it very quickly.
We'll come back to you, Congressman, as soon as we can.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'd like to now welcome our second panelist, and I thank you for testifying today. Beginning with Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, who is a member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He is also founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, and is the author of A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim patriot's fight to save his faith. Dr. Jasser is the first-generation American Muslim whose parents fled the oppressive Ba'ath regime in Syria. He earned, I should say, his medical degree on a U.S. Navy scholarship and served 11 years in the United States Navy. Dr. Jasser has testified before the House and Senate and briefed members of the House and Senate on many occasions in the past. We'll then hear from Nina Shea, who is currently Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, where she directs the Center for Religious Freedom. She has been an international human rights lawyer for 30 years. During that time, has worked at Freedom House and served as a member of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Ms. Shea has also been appointed as a U.S. delegate to the United Nations, main body of human rights, by both Republican and Democratic administrations. She regularly presents testimony before Congress, travels extensively, and writes on religious freedom issues in many well-known news outlets. We'll then hear from Dr. John Eibner, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Christian Solidarity International in the United States and frequently travels around the world to frontline situations to document gross human rights abuses. Dr. Eibner has directed human rights campaigns for CSI on behalf of persecuted Christian communities in the former Soviet Union, Egypt, Iraq, and Sudan. He has recently returned from a trip to Syria. We are grateful for his insights into the conditions there. Dr. Eibner also served as CSI's main representative at the United Nations in Geneva and has written extensively on human rights issues for a range of well-known publications. I note parenthetically, one of my first trips to the East Bloc was to Romania back in the early 1980s with CSI. We met with a number of dissidents, combated the atrocities of the Ceausescu regime, and as a direct result of that, I introduced legislation to take away MFN from Romania because of its egregious human rights abuse, but CSI played a pivotal role in my and Frank Wolf's work on Romania. We'll then hear from the Reverend Majid El-Shaifi, who is a human rights advocate who has established 2 successful human rights organizations and is currently founder and the president of One Free World International, an organization that focuses on the rights of religious minorities around the world. Reverend El-Shaifi advocates globally for Christians, China's Uyghur Muslim, Baha'i, Muslims, Jews, Falun Gong, and so many others. He is frequently called upon to provide expert testimony in refugee and protection proceedings in both Canada and the United States. His work has been covered in a wide range of television, radio, and print media, and has taken the gospel and the human rights advocacy implicit in the gospel faithfully all over the world. Dr. Jasser, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Smith and subcommittee members for holding this very important hearing. I request that my written statement be submitted to the record along with a special report that our commission, USERF, put together called Protecting and Promoting Religious Freedom in Syria.
Without objection, so ordered, and all of your full statements and any additional information that you would like to have affixed to it will be made a part of the record.
Thank you. Well into its 3rd year, the Syrian civil war has widespread implications both for religious freedom or belief and the stability of the region and beyond. The Syrian people have experienced indescribable horrors, with almost 93,000 dead, 4.2 million internally displaced, and 1.6 million refugees. Stories refugees relayed to USERF, our commission, remain vivid in my mind. Our staff visited there earlier this month, visited Egypt and Jordan. A regime soldier tortured by his colleagues because he refused to shoot civilian Sunni women and children. A mother relaying how the regime questions children about the opposition. The wrong answer can mean death to the child, the family, and high school and university students despairing about their own futures. The war hits especially close to home for me and my family. I'm the son of Syrian immigrants. We daily sit on edge waiting to hear from family members, as so many American Syrians do. My own in Aleppo and Damascus, wondering who is next to be tortured, disappear, or forced to choose between the regime or death. But what is the nature of this conflict? The Assad regime has created a humanitarian crisis on a scale not recently seen in the region. And it will certainly get worse, and it's on its way to heading exponentially as the vacuum which has been Damascus may be on the way to what the rest of Syria has experienced. By the end of 2013, more than half of Syria's population, over 10 million people, likely will need urgent humanitarian assistance. The Assad regime turned what was peaceful political protests that began in Daraa with no religious or sectarian undertones into a sectarian conflict, most of that in the last year. Despite wide defections and a paralyzed economy, remaining regime-associated individuals are supported by a foreign military aid, training, and fighters who belong to U.S.-designated terrorist groups. Foreign countries the U.S. considers to be allies sponsor the opposition, but many of which that we consider allies have very different visions of moderation and religious freedom. The regime and foreign fighters particularly fuel sectarian fires which target people of faith. There have been over 2,000 mosques and churches that have been targeted, and many of which have been destroyed. The Assad family's brutal authoritarian rule, make no mistake, this started 42 years ago, and it created the political conditions and sectarian divisions that the regime is cashing in on today, fueling today's conflict. With political opposition banned and security forces perpetrating egregious human rights abuses, dozens of domestic and foreign opposition groups have emerged, as we've heard in testimony. Some espouse democratic reform, and others are religiously motivated in using violence for that religious motivation, such as the U.S.-designated terrorist group Jabhat al-Nusra Front. And they are often way too desperate to work together, complicating the situation for religious freedom in the region. The Assads have selectively permitted religious freedom for the smallest religious minority groups as long as they did not politically oppose the regime. While religious minorities will certainly be more vulnerable in a post-Assad Syria should extremist groups take power, the Assad regime has targeted Sunni Muslims, as we've heard with Mr. Weber's questions about the numbers, committing against them the most egregious human rights and religious freedom violations. But certainly the religious minorities are caught in the middle. Estimated pre-conflict population in Syria was 22 million, 75% of which are Sunni Muslim, 12% Alawi, 10% Christian, 4% Druze, and Yazidis, Shia Muslims, Ismailis, and Jews are less than 1% each. The religious minorities increasingly are being forced to take sides in this vacuum. The Assad regime used sectarian rhetoric to discourage Christians and other religious minorities from supporting the opposition, whom the regime refers to all along with all Sunni Muslims as extremists and terrorists, who will turn Syria into an Islamic state inhospitable to religious minorities. And in fact, the Assad regime has fomented an environment in which the radicalization of not only bringing in al-Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra, but it has caused the radicalization of many of those who started off peacefully. The regime frightens Christians by predicting a fate like the Egyptian Coptic Christians and Iraqi Christians should the opposition succeed, and thus frightening them into taking sides. Al-Qaeda-affiliated foreign terrorists and wide deployment of Shabiha, which are the regime terror squads, makes credible this argument. The Alawite community from which the Assad's Ba'athist party arises, however, is not monolithic, with some elites abandoning the regime for the opposition and denouncing the violence perpetrated against civilians. And if we accept the regime narrative that this is a sectarian battle, which it has turned into, then we buy into their rhetoric. Foreign Assad supporters also are entering Syria and stoking sectarianism, including Hezbollah, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guards, and Shiite fighters from Iraq. Alarmingly, Syria's sectarian conflict now appears to be spreading beyond its borders, including into Lebanon and Iraq, seeing levels of sectarian violence in these surrounding countries that we hadn't seen before. Despite being in the middle, religious minorities are not fleeing Syria in the numbers anticipated. Most of the 1.6 million refugees are Sunni Muslims. At the end of April, UNHCR reported that less than 1% of each minority community has registered and had been registered in Egypt and Iraq, Jordan, or Lebanon, while about 300,000 Christians reportedly are internally displaced. Data for others, though, are difficult to find and unavailable. Christians and Alawites, who constitute less than 1% of registered refugees, largely are moving back to their homes or regime-held areas that they are beginning to feel now are safer from regime bombing. I'll highlight lastly a few of our recommendations. The U.S. should assist the Syrian opposition coalition in any future post-Assad government to protect likely targets of sectarian or religious-motivated violence, including religious minorities. Next, to offset the influence of extremist groups who establish Sharia courts in liberated areas, the U.S. government should provide technical training and support to local councils, courts, lawyers, and judges on domestic laws and our international standards relating to human rights and religious freedom. As nations like Saudi Arabia and Qatar vie for influence, the U.S. government should form a coalition with partners within the Friends of Syria in support of efforts to promote intra- and inter-religious tolerance and respect for religious freedom and related rights. The U.S. government should establish a Syrian refugee resettlement program for those fleeing religious persecution. So in essence, Chairman Smith, sectarian violence has been both imported into Syria and ignited within by the Assad regime as a final justification to maintain its tyranny. We must seek these and other remedies now and post-Assad to address the plight of religious minorities and all free people in Syria for whom the United States may well be their last best hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jasser. Ms. Shea.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you, Chairman Smith. I commend you and the two subcommittees for holding this critically important hearing. The persecution of religious minorities concerns America's core values, but it is one the United States has failed to address in Iraq to the devastation of the Christian, Mandaean, and Yazidi communities there. And the U.S. must not fail to recognize a similar threat that has already developed in Syria. I will focus today in my testimony on Syria's Christians and the threat that they face to their continued existence in their ancient homeland. This threat applies equally to Syria's other defenseless and even small minorities, for example, the Yazidis. And I'd like to enter into the record a statement of the Yazidi Human Rights Organization as well as the assessment statement of the Syrian National Council. Though no religious community has been spared egregious suffering, Syria's ancient Christian minority has cause to believe that it confronts an existential threat. This was said by the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry on Syria. And this group, in contrast to Syria's larger groups, has no defender. Primarily ethnically Assyrian, but also Armenian and Arab, and numbering about 2 million, the Christians face a distinct peril so dire that their ability to survive in Syria is being seriously doubted by the church and by secular observers as well. While in some neighborhoods they struggle to maintain defense committees, they lack militias of their own, nor do they have protective tribal structures or support from any outside power. The Christians are indeed stranded in the middle of a brutal war where each side, regime and rebel, fires rockets into civilian areas and carry out indiscriminate attacks. The Christian churches, which were registered and permitted by the Assad regime, have not formally allied themselves with either side in the conflict, though they've been under intense pressure to do so. However, they are not simply caught in the middle as collateral damage. They are the targets of a more focused shadow war. Christians are the targets of an ethno-religious cleansing by Islamist militants and their Sharia courts. In addition, they have lost the protection of the Assad government, making them easy prey for criminals and fighters whose affiliations are not always clear. As Archbishop Jean Bar of Aleppo's Malachite Greek Catholic Church states, Christians are terrified by the Islamist militias and fear that in the event of their victory, they would no longer be able to practice their religion and that they would be forced to leave the country. He went on to explain, quote, as soon as they reached the city of Aleppo, Islamist guerrillas, almost all of them from abroad, took over the mosques. Every Friday, an imam launches their messages of hate, calling on the population to kill anyone who does not practice the religion of the Prophet Muhammad. They use the courts to level charges of blasphemy. Who is contrary to their way of thinking pays with his life, end of quote. Unprotected, the Christians are also prime victims of kidnappers and thieves. Such threats and assaults are driving out the 2,000-year-old Christian community en masse from various parts of the country. Archdeacon Yokana of the Assyrian Church of the East, who works with Syrian refugees, wrote to me recently, quote, we are witnessing another Arab country losing its Christian Assyrian minority. When it happened in Iraq, nobody believed Syria's term would come. Christian Assyrians are fleeing massively from threats, kidnappings, rapes, and murders. Behind the daily reporting about bombs, there is an ethno-religious cleansing taking place, and soon Syria can be emptied of its Christians. Syriac League President Habib Afram states that Christians are, quote, systematically targeted with kidnappings, which are used either to collect ransom or to terrorize them into leaving. The highest profile attack, of course, was the kidnapping by gunmen in April of the Greek Orthodox Archbishop Yazigi and Syriac Orthodox Archbishop Ibrahim. This sent an unmistakable signal to all Christians. None is protected. Other clergy have been kidnapped and disappeared as well. In February, 27-year-old Father Michael Kayal of the Armenian Catholic Church in Aleppo was abducted while riding on a bus, and Islamists spotted his clerical garb. He has not been seen since. A similar fate befell the Greek Orthodox priest Maher Mahfouz around the same time. Last December, Syrian Orthodox parish priest Father Fadi Haddad was kidnapped after he left his church in the town of Katana to negotiate the release of one of his kidnapped parishioners. A week later, his mutilated corpse was found by the roadside with his eyes gouged out. His murderers are unknown. And reports are just in today that St. Anthony's Monastery in Idlib was stormed on last Sunday and killed, the Islamist rebels killed Father Francois Mourad, who was defending the nuns there. Ordinary individuals, too, have been summarily killed after being identified as Christian. An Islamist gunman stopped the bus to Aleppo and checked the background of each passenger. When the gunman noticed Johannes' last name was Armenian, they singled him out for a search. After finding a cross around his neck, quote, one of the terrorists shot point blank at the cross, tearing open the man's chest. A woman from Hasaki recounted in December to Swedish journalist Nori Kino how her husband and son were shot in the head by Islamists. Quote, our only crime is being Christians, she answers when asked if there had been a dispute. Gabriel, an 18-year-old, fled with his family from Haseki after his father was shot for having a crucifix hanging from his car's rear view mirror. The son told Kino, quote, after the funeral, the threats against our family and other Christians increased. The terrorists called us and said it was time to disappear. We had that choice, or we would be killed. The New York Times reported that a young Syrian refugee demonstrated how he was hung by his arms, robbed, and beaten by rebels, quote, just for being a Christian. Muslims, of course, are subjected to kidnapping too, but the Wall Street Journal reported on June 11th, often, quote, their outcome is different because they have armed defenders. It told the story of a 25-year-old cab driver, Hafez al-Mohammed, who said he was kidnapped and tortured for 7 hours by Sunni rebels in Al-Waer in late May. He was released after Alawites threatened to retaliate by kidnapping Sunni women. Many also pointed to criminal assaults and a government that fails to protect them. A refugee detailed to a journalist, quote, two men from a strong Arabic tribe decided one day to occupy our farmland, just like that. When I went to the police to report, I was told there was nothing they could do. The police chief was very clear that they would not act, as they didn't want the tribe to turn against the regime. Christians also fear the Talibanization through Sharia courts, where they are given 4 choices, either to pay a jizya tax, to convert to Islam, flee, or be killed. Half of Aleppo and other places are already under these courts. And by the way, the villagers from the areas where these courts have taken over have reported to the Catholic press that the fighters were foreign and were recruited, and some told of having been recruited by being told that they were going to liberate Jerusalem. There are reports that Christians are leaving Syria in droves, though the details have been sparse. And this is partially due to the fact that these Christians are fearful of and avoid the refugee camps. So they are therefore not registered with the UN as refugees. An Orthodox cleric concludes it would not be good if all Christians were to leave Syria because then the church would disappear here. But those who stay risk their lives and the lives of their children. And Mr. Chairman, my time is almost up, so I just want to say that I have a number of recommendations. I'm not going to say them all here now, but I would like to point out that the situation of the Christians and the other minorities should be, defenseless minorities, should be accurately reflected in a special report, one that the Congress could mandate or in official speeches from the bully pulpits of our highest level officials. That so far has not happened. The State Department Religious Freedom Report on Syria, which was released last month, notes rather blandly that there are reports of harassment of Christians and that societal tolerance for Christians was, quote, dwindling. So there were a few actual cases were cited by the State Department, and there's not really the slightest hint in this gross understatement that the threat they face is an existential one. And there have been no statements issued by the White House's Atrocity Prevention Task Force either on this issue. And therefore, I would support the bill that was introduced by Congressman Frank Wolf and Ann Eshoo, and that you're co-sponsoring for a special envoy for religious minorities. And I just want to conclude by saying that the that the there's a real danger that refugee relief is not reaching these smallest minorities because, again, they're not in the UN camps and they're not being registered by the UN, and that they are rather seeking shelter in churches and monasteries in Lebanon and Turkey, and that the United States should make an effort to identify those places and to count those refugees and to give them aid and to ensure that that humanitarian aid, which is desperately needed inside Syria, also reaches their villages and neighborhoods. Thank you very much.
Ms. Shea, thank you very much. Dr. Eibner.
Thank you, Chairman Smith, for your determined leadership in the defense of human rights over many years, as you mentioned, going way back to the 1980s when you traveled with CSI as a young member. And I would like to thank the members here for their constructive questioning and contribution to the debate. I would also ask, Mr. Chairman, for my written submission to be and appendices to be placed on the record. I returned only last night from Syria, and while there I traveled with local church workers from the tranquil Mediterranean town of Tartus through the valley of Christians to war-torn homes, stopping at cloisters and villages along the way. Today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, is indeed timely and important. The war in Syria has been catastrophic for all the people of Syria and carries within it the seeds of genocide. This ever-expanding war, a war that the vast Sunni Muslim world increasingly views as a jihad, threatens to set the entire Middle East ablaze. For 2 years, our government has pursued a revolutionary policy of violent regime change and has done so in the name of the Syrian people. I would like to use this opportunity to fill in some of the gaps in Washington's regime change narrative. Syria is a multi-religious country. Religious minorities, mainly Alawites and Christians, constitute roughly 30% of the population, with Sunni Muslims in the majority. All communities have suffered greatly, but the war's seeds of genocide have the greatest potential to cleanse the country of its religious minorities. For over 4 decades, the secular-minded al-Assad dictatorship has provided a kind of protection for the religious minorities in a country where they had long experienced severe persecution under Sunni rule. The Assad regime has provided more space for non-Sunni minorities than can be found in any other Arab Sunni majority state in the region. Those who would overthrow this dictatorship have a responsibility to provide a credible alternative system of protection, one in which the vulnerable minority communities have confidence. Wherever I went in Syria, I heard from Christians about the considerable religious freedom that is guaranteed by their government: freedom to worship, freedom to provide Christian education, freedom to engage with broader society through social services, freedom to proclaim the faith through public processions on religious holidays, some of which are public holidays, and freedom from the obligation to conform to discriminatory Sharia norms. I was repeatedly asked by displaced Christians, why is America at war against us? Why is the United States destroying the infrastructure of our country? Why is Washington handing us over to Islamic extremists? They also wanted me to know that the genuine pro-democracy movement of the so-called Arab Spring had been tragically overtaken long ago by a parallel Sunni supremacist movement, one that is dominated by jihadis, many with links to al-Qaeda. Dismay was also expressed about Washington's outsourcing of much of its Syria policy to regional Sunni allies, in particular Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, all of which have grave democratic deficits and deny religious freedom and minority rights to their own citizens. It seems that America's intervention in the war is aimed primarily at detaching Syria from Shiite Iran and transforming it into a Sunni Islamic state. The goal appears to be to construct an anti-Iranian Sunni axis stretching from Turkey in the north to the Gulf states in the south. During my visit, I spoke with Christians who were personally terrorized during the Arab Spring days of 2011 by mobs pouring out of Sunni mosques shouting "Alawites to the tomb, Christians to Beirut," and other genocidal slogans. Witnesses provided accounts of murder, including ritual beheadings and religious cleansing of their neighborhoods, and the desecration of churches. Kidnappings, as we have heard, are on the increase, with Alawites and Christians as the principal victims. One Christian church worker told me that 4 Alawite cousins of a friend were kidnapped and beheaded. A nun told me that she personally knows a Christian girl who was abducted by terrorists and is now mentally disturbed on account of the abuse. The most widely known kidnapping case is that of the Syriac and Greek Orthodox archbishops of Aleppo. Such acts of terror are not senseless. They send a clear message to the religious minorities: leave the country now. The conflict in Syria today, Mr. Chairman, cannot be portrayed simply in simple terms as one of the evil Assad dictatorship, a war against the peaceful, democracy-loving people of Syria. The war has indeed taken on an ugly sectarian character. Nowadays, the religious minorities and secular-minded Sunnis that could constitute possibly a majority of the Syrian people tend to look to the Assad regime for protection, while those striving to reinstate Sunni superiority or supremacy within an Islamic state are the driving force of the anti-Assad insurrection on the ground. Finally, Mr. Chairman, if our foreign policy establishment is determined to bring an end to the Syrian war and to strengthen guarantees for the religious rights of minorities, the United States will desist from financing and arming forces of Sunni supremacism. Our government will rein in its Sunni Islamist allies and will cooperate with Russia, as President Reagan did to end the Cold War, to create conditions for successful peace talks. We need to hear from our president and from all American statesmen, irrespective of party, who wish to escalate the war effort, about their ultimate war goals and their plan for preventing genocide and guaranteeing minority rights for the Syrian people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ivner, thank you very much for your testimony. Reverend L. Shafi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for having me. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with all of you, and thank you, members of the committee and all the staffers. I know that the staffers as well work so hard. My name is Reverend Majid El Shafai. I'm founder and president of One Free World, international human rights organization based in Toronto, Canada. I'm not just the head of my organization, and I'm not just a man wearing a suit behind my desk. I used to be a prisoner back home in Egypt, and I was tortured by the Egyptian regime. And until now, I have my scars on my body, which I consider it a badge of honor. The war in Syria and what we're seeing right now in Syria started by March 2011, and I believe it started as a genuine uprising. I believe that the people was tired from the regime. I believe that they want the end of the corruption, the emergency law, and reform of the Constitution. Sadly, as we are seeing today, and we hear this expression many times, the Arab Spring, what we see today that the Arab Spring been hijacked and kidnapped to become an Arab deadly winter on the minority. We all against dictatorship. Make no mistake, we are all against dictatorship, from Mubarak to Assad to Gaddafi to Ali Abdullah Saleh, whoever they are, we are all against dictatorship. The problem when you take a dictatorship out, you create a political vacuum. Who's using this political vacuum is the extremist. And sadly, the West think that you can have a democracy and freedom between day and night in the Middle East. This will not happen. The truth and the reality, there will not be a democracy in the Middle East or true freedom without two major elements. Number one is the separation between the religion and the state. Number two is the freedom of religion of the individuals. The freedom to believe or not to believe. We see here that the attacks that this Arab Spring, or what's so-called Arab Spring, led to attacks on the Christian minorities in Syria, not just the Christians, you can find as well attacks on the Druze and the Shias. These attacks been led in areas like the Roman Catholic Church, Our Lady of Salvation, in July 5, 2012. The deadly bomb blast in August 28, 2012 in Druze and Christian areas. The arrest of many of the Christians and other minorities and torturing them on the hand of the rebels. And of course, we know about the kidnap of the Greek Orthodox Archbishop Paul Yazik and the Syrian Orthodox Archbishop Ioanna Ibrahim, which we don't know until now where they are and what's happened to them. Not only that, because when the extremists comes, they are not only danger on the minority, they are also danger on the moderate Muslims. And we see right now even incidents such as the 14-year-old Muhammad Kata in the city of Apollo, which was in a coffee shop, and he made a statement about the Prophet Muhammad. The rebels kidnapped him, they tortured him, and they killed him in public. He was a Muslim boy, he was not a Christian boy. We see as well the attacks on the Shias, like in June, in the early of June, dozens of Shia Muslims in the town of Hatla were massacred, being reported that the rebels have looted and destroyed religious sites after taking control of these areas or this region. The worst dilemma that facing Islam today as a faith is not rising of the extremists, but is the silence of the moderate Muslims. The worst dilemma that facing Islam as a faith today is not the rising of the extremists, but the silence of the moderate Muslims. We see here that United States decided that they will provide weapons to the minority, to the opposition, sorry, not to the minority, to the opposition, the rebels. It seems to me that the United States will not learn from its mistakes yet. We provided weapons to Osama bin Laden during the Mujahideen war in Afghanistan, and it turned against us. We provide weapons to Saddam Hussein during the Iraq war, and turned against us. We provide weapons to Libya, to the rebels in Libya, and 2 months later, they killed our American ambassador. Providing a weapon to the rebels in Syria will be a mistake that the innocent people will pay the price for it, especially the minorities. Nevertheless, if the United States nonetheless goes ahead with the military aid, it must demand accountability from the rebels, include the return of the weapons after the conflict, and deny any further aid if weapons or ammunition are used against minorities, civilians, or American allies such as Israel. Let's make it clear. United States pledged $500 million in humanitarian aid. If the rebels refuse to respect the minority rights, women's rights, stop child abuse, we have to stop, or at least to connect our humanitarian aid with the improvement of human rights in these countries. I believe that the American people is tired of using their tax money to support terrorist groups, such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and elsewhere. In the end, and my closing remark, I believe that our world today is unfair place, is unjust place, not because the people is doing evil, but because the people who remain silent about it. History will not remember the silence. History will not remember the words of our enemy, but will remember the silence of our friends. The persecuted Christians and the minorities is dying, but they still smiling. They are in very deep, dark night, but they still have the candle of hope. Believe me when I tell you, they can kill the dreamer, but no one can kill the dream. Thank you, Mr. Chair. God bless.
Thank you very much, Reverend Al-Shafi, for not only presenting testimony, but as a man who's literally been tortured for his faith. Thank you for being here and for giving us the insights of your
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
of your thoughts and where we should go. Let me ask the entire panel a couple of questions, and I'll just lay it out, and if you could respond. I had asked earlier of the Deputy Assistant Secretary as to whether or not he, and especially the administration, construed what's going on against the Christians to be genocide. I would point out that Syria acceded to the Genocide Convention in 1955, and Article 1 makes it very clear that genocide means, and this is right from the convention, any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group. And then Article 3 talks about the acts that are punishable: genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide. You don't even have to do it. The mere conspiracy is an actionable offense. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, complicity in genocide. And yet, like we saw with Sudan, and I remember, Ms. Shea, you were very active and outspoken during previous administrations when we utterly refused, as did the Europeans, as did the UN Human Rights Council, to call what was going on in Darfur a genocide. And I'm wondering, if each of you could say whether or not you believe what's happening to the Christians rise to the level of genocide. Secondly, I had asked earlier about conditionality, and Reverend, you talked about the importance of conditionality with human rights. And I noted that even Napoleon Duarte, the former president of El Salvador, told me directly how important conditionality was when it comes to human rights, even within his own government. And I'm wondering, we heard a lot about vetting. I'm not sure how vetting is done in an efficacious way to ensure that the bad guys don't get the guns. But the conditionality issue, I'm not sure. There are conditions. If you know of any, please say. Let me ask Dr. Jasser, if you could add. You mentioned, and I read your recommendations, the 20 recommendations that were made by the Commission. Has the administration embraced all, some, or any of those recommendations that were made by the International Religious Freedom Commission? Then I have a few other questions that I'll yield to my colleagues.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. I'll address the last one first in my role as a commissioner. We have begun having conversations at a staff level regarding our recommendations, and our report is a little over a month and a half, 2 months old, so we're in the process of hoping that they adopt some of those recommendations because of the plight of religious minorities, but I can't speak officially and obviously we're not part of the administration to be able to speak on their behalf on what they feel about those recommendations. We do hope as a result of this testimony that they do look at them and embrace them as a method in which we should employ the way to protect religious minorities. To speak to your other questions, again, our report and my testimony does lay out the egregious and horrific plight of the Syrian people across various faith groups and the sectarian divides. However, as you mentioned and many have mentioned, labeling it as a genocide involves certain legal and other ramifications that I can't do as a commissioner. But let me just speak on my own behalf personally. I do think that obviously what needs to, as somebody who speaks to Syrians frequently and trying to keep in contact with them that are just not knowing if they'll be around tomorrow, to see, for example, what's happened to Sunni Muslims, the millions now, a population of Syria of 22 million, with 1 to 2 million displaced refugees, 90+% of which are Sunni Muslims. I'd be hard-pressed as an American citizen who cares about humanitarian rights not to say that there's a genocide against Sunni Muslims in Syria. But what happens in all conflicts, and what is the last card that Assad has pulled, is fomenting sectarian divisions. So what's going to happen, and what the gates of Assad allowing al-Qaeda into his country has been to basically allow them to have competing genocides so that he can legitimize, the regime can legitimize their continued existence. Because I will tell you, as much as I agree, and in my testimony I talked about atrocities committed by some of the rebels. Now, is there a command and control center for the FSA? There isn't, and there's obviously many, many groups. But God help the minorities, such as the Christians, who may disagree politically with the Baathists or with their political ends, because at the end they may have the religious freedom to practice, but there is certainly that saved for those who are not politically against the regime's authoritarian means. And I think lastly, as far as vetting, I think it's important, and I will tell you that the trajectory of the conflict, we've tried now for 28 months plus, the do nothing and let the friends of Syria sort of guide it, and it has gotten us to this point of talking about competing genocides and almost 100,000 dead. And I think at the minimum, the choices that we have as far as protecting religious minorities is to begin to play a role to help push it, as Mr. Kinzinger said earlier, to help push history towards at least giving those that would like a democratic, moderate Syria a chance at promoting those values and helping those who would be our real allies on the ground have the ability to see a future Syria that's not run by either extreme. And I think at least us playing some type of a role there, and in the recommendations we give as far as helping those who promote our principles within the Friends of Syria, and also building infrastructure there that can help provide safe haven within the opposition.
Yes, Gina. Nita.
Yeah, I think every one of us who is really monitoring the situation with the minorities, the smallest defenseless minorities in Syria, has very much Iraq on the precedent of Iraq on our minds. And in Iraq, over the last 10 years, 2/3 of the Christian population there have been eliminated. They've been driven out by violence. Many of them have been killed, but most are just been sent into exile. 90% of the Mandeans, the followers of John the Baptist, have also been eliminated from Iraq under the same conditions. The Yazidis, over half. So these are the smallest defenseless minorities. They've essentially been ethnically, or religiously, I should say, cleansed from Iraq. That's very much on our minds now in Syria, as hearing these anecdotes about, and hearing the church leaders attest to what is happening to the Christian people. And I also received a letter this week from the Yazidi representative saying the same thing, Yazidi villages emptying out. So that is why, because when the dust settles, there may not be any small defenseless minorities left in Iraq. There will be Sunnis, there will be Shiites, as horrific as the violence has been against those groups and the Alawites. Those groups do have champions outside Syria, and have militias and militaries at their disposal. These smallest defenseless minorities do not. In my first recommendation, I said that there should be a report trying to establish exactly what is happening, and that's why I support the special envoy, because we hear the anecdotes, we don't have the dimensions of this problem, but of course we fear a genocidal situation. And this problem will not end when this war ends, because there are so many militants committed who are so intolerant. And I am very concerned by Secretary Kerry's statements today in Saudi Arabia, where he said, meeting with the Saudi Foreign Minister, Saud al-Faisal, saying that he expresses appreciation for Saudi Arabia's leadership within the region, and saying that we believe that every minority can be respected. So I express our appreciation for Saudi Arabia's leadership within the region. We believe that the best solution is a political solution, and we believe that every minority can be respected, that there can be diversity and pluralism. I don't know who the we is there. If that's the United States, then fair enough. But if he's talking about our partner, our closest partner in the region, as he starts out his speech, by referring to Saudi Arabia, then he is sadly mistaken. There's not a single church or other house of worship other than the Wahhabi mosques and some Shiites mosques in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia does not believe in diversity and pluralism and does not respect minorities. I am very concerned. I think there should be a special envoy to understand more clearly what is happening to these minorities, especially since they do not register when they go into exile. They do not register with the UN. They are afraid of being minorities again in the UN camps and being victims again outside of Syria, in Turkey or other places. So that has to be taken into account as well. We do not know how many Christian refugees there are. There have been some guesses of hundreds of thousands, but we really have no idea, and this has to be assessed.
The CSI issued a genocide alert for the whole Middle East region because we were concerned that conditions for genocide exist. It doesn't mean to say that there's full-blown genocide, but there is very good cause for concern, as we heard from the representative from the State Department. The situation in Syria is more acute than anywhere else in the region because of the conflict there and the vulnerability of the minorities. What we see are acts of genocide or genocidal massacres which have affected every minority community in Syria, including Sunni Muslims, if you think of them as a minority in places where there is perhaps an Alawite majority, certain provinces and regions where the Sunni Muslims are very vulnerable. And we see a situation developing in Syria that is out of control, and it will look very much like the Balkans, like Bosnia, where every side in the conflict was involved in massacres and acts of genocide, crimes against humanity. So we're deeply concerned about this. We're deeply concerned that just over a year ago, if I'm not mistaken, there was an atrocities prevention board that was announced with much fanfare at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and we have not heard anything about what their findings are. Are they concerned about the possibility of genocide? Not even genocide, but atrocities. What do they see as going on, and what are their recommendations? I would have thought that members in the public would want to know what the Atrocities Board is doing and what their take on the situation in Syria is. Another cause for great concern, I'm a historian by background, and one cannot help but look back to the days of the Ottoman Empire, when in 1908 there was a great revolution. You might call it the Ottoman Spring, where members of all religious communities, ethnic communities, were dancing in the streets to celebrate freedom, and within a decade there's genocide, and Anatolia is completely cleared of its religious minorities. It can happen. It can happen today. It can happen this year. It can happen within the next decade. We, the United States, have an international obligation to try to prevent genocide. There are international undertakings that we have signed up. I would like to see the United States government take these seriously and act on their responsibilities. And just another observation about the movements of people. I think that one can learn a lot about a situation by seeing how people vote with their feet. They are not able to vote with the ballot in Syria, but there's something that can be picked up by movement, how people move around the country. And what I have observed is that when people are forced to flee their homes, and in most cases it's not because of targeted violence against them or their religious community, but there's shelling, there's bombing, there's a war going on, and they want to get out of there, they tend to go either abroad or they tend to go to areas controlled by the government, such as Tartus province, which is relatively tranquil. And I saw myself that there are many Sunni refugees or displaced people who are living there, trying to stay out of harm's way. And of course, like all Syrians, they are denied their political freedoms, but I did not detect any sign of special harassment or that they were targeted by the government. And after all, we must bear in mind, too, that while the Assad regime is a dictatorship that does not respect basic human rights and does not provide democracy, it does not have an ideology that targets religious minorities. Unfortunately, we see increasingly an opposition that is dominated by the forces that have an ideology that say Christians are not equal citizens, Alawites are not equal citizens, and they should either leave, or if they stay, they have to have a second-class role in society. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I believe that my colleagues here answered your question in details. I don't want to repeat their words. There is some people here already tired, so I think I don't have anything to add on that.
Okay. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish our colleague from Texas was still here, because I find this discussion quite fascinating. If I'm understanding you correctly, Mr. Jasser, you think that the United States ought to take a risk and arm the rebels because the Assad regime is so brutal that the alternative can't be worse, and that's where we ought to sort of put our chips. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I thought I heard you kind of say that.
Well, our Commission's recommendations do not get into those types of details. We get into the fact that there are things we need to do on the ground in a humanitarian way to help move to the protection of religious minorities. I did make a comment personally, not as a commissioner, that I do believe the last 28 months of not helping the opposition at all has proven that the Darwinian solution of sort of letting it play itself out has brought the worst actors in the region into Syria, has caused the biggest devastation. And the sense that there's a binary choice in Syria now, which is between al-Qaeda and the Assad regime, I think is a false choice. I think the opposition's numbers clearly show that the majority of them are the millions of Syrians that have been devastated in this.
Right. So, all right, not wearing your commission hat, yeah, you personally still think we ought to bet down and invest in the opposition, even with some queasiness?
Absolutely, because the choice of doing nothing is going to bring the worst pathway. And the pathway towards repairing a country that's been devastated by 50 years of dictatorship will involve some growing pains. It may involve, arming some of the wrong people, but we can correct those with involvement versus letting Qatar and Saudi Arabia decide the future of Syria.
Got it. Perfectly legitimate point of view, but let me ask you two questions. One is, in making that recommendation to the United States government, if you had a magic wand and you were the chief recommender, that would be your recommendation. Are you also willing, when you make such a recommendation, to take responsibility for the possibility that the outcome isn't at all what you hope for, and that, as a matter of fact, you're wrong, that what we've done by intervening and providing military assistance is to actually strengthen the hands of those we do not wish to strengthen, and we produce an outcome we do not wish, a jihadist, theocratic-oriented, intolerant of minorities regime that actually respects diversity even less than the Ba'athist regime it replaces. I mean, I know that's not what you wish, but when you ask the United States, a power, superpower, to intervene in this kind of situation in that way, somebody has to take responsibility for the risk, the probability, slim, moderate, remote, or high, that the outcome is going to be worse than the regime it's replacing.
Sir, speaking on my own behalf, I would tell you that if we exerted real leadership as leaders of the free world in that region, and we actually stood behind those decisions, not just for 6 months, but for years, and laid out, educated the American public about what's at stake, not only for Syria, but the entire region, for our allies Israel and the empowerment of Iran, and played that out over not 1 or 2 years, but over the next 10, 15 years, and saying that we will have a policy that will be pushed forth to protect minorities, to protect those who believe in the values of freedom and liberty within that region, and say that there are no clear answers, but doing nothing is going to allow a Darwinian solution that will allow the last 2.5 years that has demonstrated the death and devastation and actually the loss of American interest, and our allies in the West have lost significant influence in Syria with the devastation that we've seen. So, choices will evolve, but I do believe that currently we've seen the failure of the current policy, and while I can completely understand your concerns, but I believe helping the opposition is a better choice than doing nothing.
Now, you're in a panel with 3 others who are concerned about protecting the rights of minorities, especially religious minorities. And I think I heard every one of your three colleagues at this panel actually differ with you. They're very concerned about arming the rebels because they actually cited the lack of respect for religious diversity within the armed insurgency in Syria.
Well, sir, I'm also concerned about arming the rebels, but I do believe that the solutions so far have created a vacuum. There have been no solutions. And if you look at our recommendations that come from USERF, it involves a much more active role in protecting those minorities and ensuring that the current Syrian coalition and others are accountable to international standards of human rights, to which we have not held them accountable because we're taking such a back seat in what's happening there that we need to take a front seat rather than allow other countries, as Ms. Shea mentioned, like Saudi Arabia, that really have no respect for religious freedom, to play a role in a future Syria where you have both sides. One is Iranian standards of religious freedom and Saudi standards of religious freedom, both of whom are on the worst lists as far as advocacy for religious freedom. I believe America would play a better role.
Dr. Jesser, I just say to you, I certainly respect your point of view. I wish the world were that black and white. I wish our choices were that simple. They're not. And I'm not sure, in fact, I know I don't accept your characterization that we've somehow taken a back seat for 28 months. I'm not quite sure what you would have us do. And I would say that when the United States intervenes in that region, very overtly, it can lead with the best of intentions to results that are undesirable. I'm not sure the intervention in Lebanon under the Ronald Reagan administration was such a wise policy in retrospect. It led to terrible deaths for the United States, and I'm not sure it led to an improved outcome in Lebanon. History will have to judge. You know, the President got a lot of criticism for leading from behind in Libya, and yet I will say to you, and I was in both Egypt and Libya last year, I was more hopeful about the outcomes in Libya in terms of pluralism and respect for minority rights, albeit it's a much smaller country, than I was for Egypt. And I've been to Egypt many times. So I wish, our options were really clear-cut and we could find the guys with the white hats, because I'd support them too. But I'm not so sure that it's clear, nor was it as clear 28 months ago, that the insurgency was only composed of elements of people wearing white hats. Now, Ms. Shea, let me ask you, you gave a very interesting analogy, Iraq. The interesting thing that both Iraq and Syria shared, of course, when Saddam Hussein was still in power, is they both had Ba'athist regimes. And Dr. Eibner actually cited the Ba'athist philosophy or political governance, not in an admiring way, but he reminded us that the one thing, though, that was true was you weren't having a whole bunch of Christians and other minorities fleeing because they were worried about the oppression and brutality of the regime on their rights. They weren't being singled out as such in a way that, unfortunately, they seem to be, at least with some elements of the insurgency in Syria. Is that your view as well? That terrible though the brutality of Saddam Hussein was, no one's praising that regime. There was a difference between the Ba'athist philosophy that governed both in Iraq and Syria with respect to minority rights, or with respect to minorities, including religious minorities, that is quite different than an explicit, avowed, they're not us kind of philosophy that seems to come out of at least some of the more extreme elements of the insurgency in Syria today. And for that matter, in the post-Saddam Hussein world of Iraq, whatever respect there was for minority rights seems to have dissipated and worsened in the current situation in Iraq. Are those views you would share?
Both regimes, in a way, they were mirror images of each other. They were both Ba'athist and secular, but they were both the minorities themselves. Saddam Hussein was, of course, a Sunni minority in the Shiite Iraq, and Assad is
Alawite, right.
minority aligned with the Shiites and a majority Sunni Syria. And so that there was an emphasis on building a secular society from those regimes, and therefore there was more space for other minorities, like the Christians and the Yazidis, et cetera. I don't think there's any going back to that, though, in Syria. I think what we're seeing now is the Assad regime making deals with tribes and others at the expense of these minorities. They're letting gangs of criminals prey on these minorities with impunity, just as actually is happening now in Iraq. It continues to happen in Iraq. With the impunity situation that USERF has identified. So, but there is the jihadist element in the rebels that is extremely worrisome, and these are being supported, it's no secret, from the Gulf region.
Yeah, I was struck by your testimony and that of the other two panelists to the other side of you, not because not because you were saying that we should go back or we should shore up the Assad regime because given the alternative, it's the lesser of two evils, but to show that our choices in Syria are not so clear and that the outcomes are at high risk. That is an argument to do nothing, but it is an argument to take care and caution and to make sure we know what we're doing before we just rush in and support one side or the other.
I oppose military aid, for what it's worth, from my opinion, to Syria at this point, and I conclude that we should make the peaceful settlement in Syria among our highest foreign policy priorities, and that the President should use his prestige that you identified to make that happen and to be fully engaged in it.
Thank you. Dr. Ibn, I just want to make sure I characterized your views correctly. I did? If you would just use the mic to...
There was no misrepresentation that I picked up.
Thank you. And Reverend El-Shafi?
Yes.
I thought I heard you actually say explicitly, don't arm the rebels.
That's correct.
And you said that why? Remind us again why you think, unlike Dr. Jasser, the United States should not go down that road.
Let's look at the Rabbi. First of all, allow me to explain that there is no win-win scenario about Syria. If Hafiz al-Assad stayed, Bashar al-Assad, if Bashar al-Assad stayed, Iran, Hezbollah have stronger arms in the region. If defeated, we end it with extremist Sunnis that only God knows what they will do. So there is no win-win scenario when it comes to Syria file. But let's take a look at the opposition, the Syrian opposition, the rebels. Let's look at their component, at their cells. You found like the Free Syrian Army, the National Coalition of Syrian Revolution, the opposition forces, or the Syrian Opposition Coalition. That's led by Al-Khattab, Muaz al-Khattab. He's in exile in Cairo. You have the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, or the SMB. This is a guy by the name Muhammad Riyad. He's in exile in London. When I'm looking at, and I'm not saying that they are the only ones that leading the opposition, but I'm talking about the big names and the main player. All of the names that I'm telling you right now, they are very extremist and very violent. And my fear, when we arm the rebels, even if we are arming the people that we feel that they are less extremist, that they will not have a full control on where is this weapon going, and this weapon in the end will go to kill civilians or minority, or will attack Israel, which is alliance, or will kill our ambassador in Damascus later on. That's my fear.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, you've been most indulgent. I really appreciate it. I do think this panel has given us a lot of food for thought and highlights the complexity of the choices we face in Syria. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Yoho.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Connolly, great questions. I appreciate it. And your testimony, I guess it's almost a nightmare, and we know what's going on over there, and that's my concern. And Dr. Yasser, I want to commend you and your parents for having the good sight and you the good fortune of landing on the shores of America to where you and hopefully your parents have experienced and lived, and it sounds like it, the American dream. And I think that's a basic underlying tenet for all humans, that yearning to be free. And I would love for everybody in the world to have that and experience that. But the reality is we're not there yet. Reverend Al Shafi, you're from Egypt, right?
That's correct, sir.
When you said you were tortured, who was the President Mubarak at the time?
It was the regime, the Egyptian regime. That's correct, Mubarak at the time.
Okay. And, you know, I guess back in the old days, we'll say it, things were more predictable. They weren't good, but they were predictable because if you propped up a regime, you could kind of determine how they were going to respond.
That's correct.
And how they would react. We've got a whole new ball game now. We've got a new group of people in there that have arisen from the Arab Spring, and like you said, it's turning into the Arab Winter. Their ideologies are different. They're stronger. They're stronger beliefs in, I don't want to say extreme Islam, but I mean, we're seeing that played out with Sharia law and all that. And so it's a whole different game, and we don't know how people are going to respond, and we don't know how to, I don't want to say manipulate, but how to work with them to get the results we want. And what I've heard from three of you is the way I feel. You know, arming them is a bad thing to do. I mean, we've tried that. We've seen it in Iran in the 70s. We've done it with Iraq. We've done it with Afghanistan. Libya is yet to play out. And that's one of my questions is I'd like to hear your response and what you think is turning out in Libya, if we're on the right track with what we did with the flyovers and the minimum intervention that we had, so that we can look at Syria in which way to go. Because what I've heard from all of you is the promotion of liberty, the promotion of freedoms, human rights promotion, religious freedoms. And again, I don't have to remind you, but those are more westernized ideologies, not freedom. But to promote and to try to force human rights on an Islamic country when they don't believe the way we do, I don't see how you can do that without taking complete control over a country, and that's something that's just not acceptable. What are your thoughts on that? If you would start with Libya, on how you think that's turning out right now.
Do you want me to start, or do you want to start with Jasser? The separation between the religion and the state, any religion, any state, is necessary to ensure true democracy and freedom in any country. Any religion, any state. The problem that we are seeing right now is lack of education. One of the major issues that we see in Egypt, for example, is the lack of education. Even if you reform the constitution, you have 30 to 40% of the Egyptians is illiterate.
Right.
They don't know how to read and write their own name. Even if you reform the constitution, they don't know what they are voting on. So here comes the religious guy, comes in the name of God, and they will follow him because they don't know any better. So education have to come before democracy. Without education, democracy dies. Education is the oxygen of democracy. In Libya, back to your question, in Libya, how we can see the futures in Libya. You remember there was a time that came that they said that there was somebody, American pastor, I believe in Florida, was burning the
Right.
Quran, something like that.
From my hometown.
Yeah. And we're blaming you, by the way, I'm sure. And everybody went attacking American
Right.
embassies, burning Bibles, and so on and so forth. Do you remember what's happened in Libya, sir, in this time? They went to cemeteries. There was cemeteries where the old British soldiers that fought the Second World War was. There was a cross in their cemeteries, and they went to destroy the crosses. This is after a very short period of time that we supported them, that we sent our troops to help them and to finish Gaddafi. Like the war won in Libya because the NATO troops interfered and because the American troops built no-fly zone, make no mistake.
Right.
But this is how was the response. When we are helping, I think one of the major things that we are missing in our policies is accountability. There is nothing wrong with accountability. when I'm giving you, I went to Iraq not that long time ago. I took Canadian member of parliament and Canadian senators. I live in Canada, I'm a Canadian. And I went to Iraq. It was the first Canadian delegation to go to Iraq after the war. Canada gave to Iraq $300 million. When I met with the vice president and when I met with the deputy prime minister, I told them, what did you do with this money? They said, we don't know. I want to inform you and to ensure you that 90% of the aid that goes from the American government, if it's not more, and goes to the Libyan government or to the Iraqi government or to Syrian government at some point will be misused.
I agree, and that's, as we give foreign aid, I think we need to change our whole policy in that here's our aid, these are the conditions you take it under. We believe in these things. We believe in human rights. We believe in freedom of expression or religious freedoms and all that. I'm not going to tell you you have to do it, but if you want our money, this is what you do.
That's it.
And so, but you see Libya playing out in a favorable way, or do you think it's still rocky and it can go either way?
It's still rocky. I think Libya
so
is
too.
The cancer under the skin.
I agree.
This will come at some point.
Dr. Eibner?
Libya is very rocky indeed, and we've heard about some of the events in Libya since the revolution. One which is not mentioned by Reverend El-Shafi was the arrest of scores of Coptic Christians from Egypt in Libya, and they were tortured and abused very badly simply for allegedly sharing the gospel. So there's great cause to be concerned about the consequences of our policy in Libya. I would agree with Reverend El-Shafi that there are really two fundamental conditions for democracy. One is the separation of religion and state, and the other is the freedom to choose one's religion.
I wrote that down when you said that. How do you instill that on another country when that's not their belief?
This is exactly what I'm leading up to.
Okay.
Is that these two conditions, which I think we would all agree are fundamental conditions for democracy, are generally thought of throughout the Islamic world as un-Islamic.
Right.
And that to promote those conditions or those values is to act against Islam. That is the huge problem that we face. In order to really fundamentally change the situation, of course the United States can use its influence here and there and tinker with systems and make it a little bit better or a little bit worse, but to fundamentally change the situation so that one has so that these conditions are met, it would mean nothing short than going back to old-fashioned imperialism, where the United States moves in like the French or the British in old times. Here we are, we're here to stay, we run the show, and we take responsibility for governance. That is something that we in the United States do not do with our role as a superpower. It's another way of saying actually neo-imperial power. We want to have our, guarantee our resources, our strategic interests, but not take real responsibility. And we repeatedly take half measures like, calling for the overthrow of the Assad regime, but without having a real strategy and resources to make it happen and to make it work in a desirable way.
And that's what I see is, we're doing the same thing over and over again, but we're not getting the results we want. And I don't know how you get to that because, like you said, you can't separate religion from politics in Islam because it's one and the same. They work together in that mindset. And we're trying to say, well, we want to separate religion from the politics. We want the religious freedom.
Well, I don't believe that these are our real goals as a nation. Our strategic goals are not to achieve that end. As I mentioned in my statement, I am convinced that our major strategic goal in the region is to create this Sunni axis from Turkey to the Gulf states as a barrier to Shiite in Iran. And these human rights issues and religious liberty issues are sadly sacrificed on the altar of these greater geopolitical interests that our nation has.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. Ms. Shea?
Yeah, I want to second what my co-panelists have said about Libya, but I think that it's very important to focus on Egypt and to think about Egypt as you are. We do provide billions of support for the government even now, and maybe putting Egypt soon on life support as it threatens to teeter over the cliff of failed statehood. June 30th is a date to watch, that they're planning big demonstrations against the regime and counter demonstrations against the protesters. And Egypt is the country in the Middle East with the largest, in the Muslim Middle East with the largest Christian population by far, maybe 8 to 10 million Christians. Only three others rise to anywhere near 1 million, and that's Syria with perhaps 1 million or so Christians, Lebanon, and Iraq, which has been devastated, the Christian population there. If the Copts are continue to be attacked, it's going to be a very, very difficult situation. And it will signal further radicalization of that whole area, because once the great cultural crossroads in history, this Middle Eastern region, it will be totally Islamicized for the first time and can be expected to radicalize.
And that's my concern. That's where I see we're heading with the policies we have. And, you know, I've read all your stuff in here, and what I look forward to is redirecting our foreign policy in a way that it's not interventionism. It's more on trade, technological advice and help along those lines. And that's what I look forward to doing.
We don't have any red line at all in our aid to Egypt to protect the Christian minority there, and we should.
Okay. Doc?
Thank you. And if I am just sort of, there's some issues I just think we really need to address. And as far as promoting religious freedom abroad, you know, the mechanism is the narrative. I think many of us agree on the symptoms, that there are religious minorities being attacked, that their plight is as grim as it's ever been. But then as you make that assessment, you can't get away from the fact that you cannot defeat al-Qaeda and radical Islam in Syria or in Egypt or in Saudi without changing the dictatorships. Assad allowed al-Qaeda in because it's a mechanism for sectarian controlling his population. So if the narrative becomes a binary choice, I can tell you, as you mentioned, my family, you know, they saw as they were in and out. My grandfather was in and out of prison in the 50s as dictatorship after dictatorship happened in Syria, and then it solidified into this Ba'athist regime. They looked upon the West as the leader of the free world and a place to come to build these ideas that, not as a commissioner, but my NGO is based on the separation of mosque and state, is based on advocating Islamic ideas against groups like the Brotherhood. But Egypt, for example, will finally be able to treat the condition of theocracy that comes from the Brotherhood through the freedom that it got after the departure of Mubarak. So to think that it's going to be clean and not a mess is not what I'm trying to say, but to say somehow that Arabs or Muslims are any different than Americans were at their revolution is just, I don't believe the human narrative that's part of the International Religious Freedom Act, that every human being wants to be free when left to their own devices. In the United States, I believe, and I think to say that sitting on our hands doesn't have, you know, sort of keeps us clean of what's happening and with no moral obligation, and somehow we can then during any political cycle say that we had nothing to do with the changes there, I don't think is a fair assessment, in that there are choices, and if Syria continues to go south and radicalized, that will be a choice we've allowed to happen, and that we could have steered it in a different direction. Certainly some interests will try to blame people that decide to help the opposition with some untoward effects that may happen, but I still believe that the last 28 months demonstrate that anything against Assad, you defeat him first, and then later and many of the Free Syrian Army say this, defeat Assad first, then we defeat al-Qaeda.
Well, and that's, you know, I want America to be the magnet in the world that people look to and aspire to look at a country that says that's what freedom does, that you can become and do whatever you want to in a country that honors those basic rights. And we have that Constitution we've been blessed with. But yet, I guess what I'm looking for is a way to have the people uprise, because it's got to come from the ground up. We can't instill it from the top down. It's not going to work. I mean, when you have 1 billion Muslims in the world that don't quite believe the way we do, to put our faith, our beliefs there, it's got to be an uprising from the ground up. And I look forward to, sending questions to you guys and hearing more from you. One of the things that has been promoted is Radio Free America, and the Freedom Network, to get that message out. And there's other things like that I know we can do on a small scale. But to promote that ideology of freedom, it's there for everybody, and help them achieve that. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Can I add something, please? Just something extremely small.
Is that okay, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
One of the things about education, like I was talking about education, the accountability of the American aid. First of all, I disagree with Dr. Jasser. If we defeated al-Assad today, we'll defeat al-Qaeda tomorrow. Never happened before in history and will not happen now. It just will not happen. Experience-wise, didn't happen. But just a quick example about education, because if you really want to build this true democracy, you have to start from the young generation. This is a book from the Egyptian schools during the time of Mubarak. Was supported, funded by American aid. The 1.9 that we give to the Egyptians after Camp David. This book, it was supposed to be it is in every school until now. When you open the book, you found in page number 24 speaking about jihad, for example, violent jihad. When you are looking at page number 11, you found that there is no Israel on the map. It does not exist completely. And so on and so forth, big examples. I think it will be much better for all of us if we are giving aid for a school, for example, to raise new generation. Let's go to the school ourselves or the embassy that in this region, like if we have the American embassy in Cairo, for example, why don't make a surprise visit to the school and grab one of the books that you paid for?
Well, I think that's a great idea, and that goes back to your idea of accountability. I mean, we all talk about transparency and accountability, but we don't see it and we don't follow through, and we can't afford to do that anymore for the sake of Syria, Egypt, all these other countries. And if we're going to spend the American taxpayers' money, when we're borrowing at the point we are and the debt we're in, we need to change the game and the rules of the game, I'll say.
Yes, sir.
And again, thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Mr. Yoho, thank you very much. And on that very point, as you and I think everyone in this room knows, that Rodgers and Hammerstein's famous South Pacific, there's a song in it where you have to be taught about racism, taught about hate, how it's passed on from generation to generation. And I and our subcommittee for years has raised the textbooks issue, particularly in the UNRWA camps, but as well as the Reverend said, with regards to books that were very much used and utilized during the Mubarak regime. The problem is we've gone from bad to worse, and I think that's what we're trying to say with this hearing, that the Christians have been targeted, as Ms. Shea so eloquently pointed out. It's not collateral damage. They are being targeted, and I don't think that understanding has been accepted by some people within the administration or within Congress or in the European community. And Dr. Jasser, as you know, during the worst days of the Bosnia conflict, not only did I make frequent trips there, but I had the hearing where we heard from the translator who was there when Mladic and the Dutch peacekeepers were lifting up glasses of wine or champagne as 8,000 Muslim men were loaded onto buses and were destroyed in an act of genocide in Srebrenica, a so-called UN safe haven. Hopefully we learned from those lessons. Part of the reason for this hearing is to say the Christians are being targeted, as Ms. Shea pointed out, and the response has been, at best, inadequate. I do believe there's good faith on the part of the administration. The problem is that we haven't had that line and say, our Deputy Assistant Secretary talked about generically talking about human rights with the opposition, the Free Syrian Army. there needs to be a very carefully delineated list of things that need to be avoided, including the targeting of Christians simply because they're Christians. So hopefully that message will be taken back. Your testimonies have been of enormous, enormous help to us. I have other questions, but it is late, and you have been very patient with your time. I will submit them for the record. But I want to thank you, and thank you for your bold and very effective leadership over the course of many, many years for each of our 4 distinguished panelists. Ms. Yoho, thank you for your participation. Thank you to my friends on the other side of the aisle. The hearing is adjourned.
Mechanical components. This plastic disc containing a spring and a weight is part of the locking mechanism. It's what stops the seatbelt straps, called the webbing, from lengthening when you jerk forward due to a sudden stop or hard deceleration. The locking mechanism goes into the seatbelt's retractor mechanism, the component that lets the webbing extend and retract. The webbing will wind onto this aluminum spool in the retractor, a rewind spring keeping it taut. Sudden deceleration will cause this silver ball to trigger the locking mechanism. This will stop the spool from rotating and lock the webbing. This next robot assembles what's called the pretensioner mechanism. While the locking mechanism stops the webbing from lengthening, the pretensioner sharply pulls the webbing back, tightening any slack. The pretensioner kicks in only in the event of a crash. The sudden deceleration on impact triggers sensors, which will signal the airbag control module to send an electrical charge to the pretensioner. This charge sets off a tiny explosion that deslacks the belt. This worker installs the explosive device called the micro gas generator, or MGG. After lubricating the inside of its aluminum cylinder with grease, she inserts a piston and the MGG. The MGG contains a chemical called nitrocellulose. The electrical charge coming from the airbag control module ignites this chemical, causing a tiny gas explosion. That generates pressure within the cylinder, driving the piston upward at high speed. This triggers a gear that winds the retractor spool backward, taking up any slack in the webbing. After capping off the microcast generator's housing, a robot transfers the completed pretensioner mechanism to the retractor's frame. Then it screws on a steel cover plate to hold the pretensioner in place. They install the rewind spring onto the spool of the retractor mechanism. This spring is what provides resistance when you pull out the webbing to buckle up. Then when you unbuckle, it rotates the spool to rewind the webbing. The car company decides what type of spring to use. The thicker the spring and the more coils, the greater the tension, and therefore the faster and smoother the belt retracts. But the greater the tension, the less comfortable the seat belt is on the body. The webbing is made of woven polyester fiber. This machine sews one end over into a loop for the pin that'll anchor the webbing to the spool. The pin is made of either plastic or steel, depending on the type of retractor they're using. A worker now threads the end through a machine that automatically winds the webbing onto the retractor spool, making sure the pin is properly attached. At the same time, the machine checks the overall belt length to make sure it conforms to the client's specifications. At this factory, every single seatbelt component has to pass a thorough quality control check. Here, a machine checks a key safety feature, a lever and ratchet mechanism that prevents the webbing from extending after you've belted in a child car seat. Now for the final assembly. Workers load all the seatbelt parts in a jig, a holding device that arranges them in the proper configuration. A worker feeds the webbing through the shoulder loop from which the belt hangs, and through the tongue plate, the part that clicks into the buckle. Both these components are made of steel for strength, with plastic coverings matching the car interior. The last step is to sew the anchor to finish off the other end of the webbing. Every seatbelt design goes through extensive testing before going into production. This machine assesses how much pull the webbing and retractor can withstand before breaking. This machine tests the webbing's durability, running it through 50,000 abrasion cycles to ensure the material doesn't wear out.
Hello, beautiful. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there. Hi, Anthony. How much does my discount double check save me?
About $150.
Done.
I don't have State Farm, but insurance, find me money.
I got you $1. Oh, you almost had it. You gotta be quicker than that.
Having insurance isn't the same as having State Farm. There to help you with unexpected savings. That's getting to a better state.
I started Lumosity for me, but it's been pretty good for the people around me, too. I remembered my friend's birthday, which is good, but I also remembered this bag she liked, and I remembered the store where we saw it. Better friendship through neuroscience. Who'd have guessed?
Any brain can get better, and Lumosity.com can help. It's like a personal trainer for your brain, improving your performance with the science of neuroplasticity, but in a way that just feels like games. Start training with Lumosity.com right now and discover what your brain can do.
With Peak Motor Oil, you get 65 years of experience in hot and cold protection from an independent, family-owned business that gives you what's right for your engine and your wallet. Peak. Run true.
Introducing Pizzeria from DiGiorno. A whole new pizza for people who are skeptical about frozen pizza. Skeptical about a crispy crust that's amazingly airy and a new sauce that's this full of flavor. But go on, be skeptical. Just means more for the rest of us. New Pizzeria from DiGiorno.
Before we do any major projects on our home,
we do a ton of research on Angie's List.
At Angie's List, you'll find reviews on everything from home repair to healthcare, written by people just like you.
With Angie's List, I save time, money, and I avoid frustration.
You'll find great companies and great Angie's List discounts.
You want to be sure the money you're about to spend is money well spent.
Before you have any work done in your home, go to Angie's List.
Find out why more than 2 million members count on Angie's List. Angie's List. Reviews you can trust.
You stole my line.
A twin-power turbo engine, striking design, and up to 34 miles per gallon. It's a lot to like, but the spacious interior cabin, that's for what you love. The legendary BMW 5 Series. We only make one thing, the ultimate driving machine. Lease a BMW 528i for $449 a month. Then take advantage of BMW's no-cost maintenance.
His morning breath has notes of saffron and a hint of lilac.
Stay thirsty, my friends.
Falls are the #1 cause of injury to senior citizens. Acorn Stairlifts has a solution. Just don't fall. Sit, relax, ride with an Acorn Stairlift, the world's leader in stairlifts. Don't let limited mobility keep you from going up and down your stairs, even outside. Call Acorn Stairlifts now for a free information kit and no obligation quote. Why risk falling when you could safely ride?
Our Acorn Stairlift is definitely more affordable than moving.
The Acorn Stairlift has a padded seat and backrest, safety sensors, stop the chair if there are obstacles. The seat swivels and locks so you don't twist your body. And the Acorn Stairlift folds away. It even works through a power shortage.
I was really surprised at how little they cost.
Call 1-800-317-3154 for free information. That number again is 1-800-317-3154. 1-800-317-3154. Call now.
Citizens of 2149, each one of you has taken a first step toward a new beginning. Welcome to Terra Nova, folks.
The Terra Nova Marathon, Sunday, July 7th on Science.
The earliest windows were merely holes cut into the walls. People living in warm climates left them uncovered, while people in harsher climates used animal skins to keep the cold out. In the Far East, people covered the opening with paper. Then came glass panes in sashes that swung in or out or hung one above the other. This type of window is called a casement window. A crank mechanism opens it at an angle. To build the window frame, the factory begins with 16.5-foot lengths of extruded PVC, a type of plastic. As clamps hold the PVC steady, a computer-guided circular saw cuts the sizes required for the frame. The same machine also cuts the pieces for the sash, the inner frame around the glass. Each frame is made from 4 pieces whose ends are mitered at a 45-degree angle. Now, workers load 8 pieces onto a computer-guided welding machine. 8 because it welds 2 frames at a time. First, a heating block, whose temperature is 446 degrees Fahrenheit, melts the ends. Then the machine pushes them together. They fuse, forming the frame's 4 corners. Here's the same process viewed from above. As the melted ends bond under pressure, excess PVC oozes out at the joints, then hardens. The next machine will clean that up. A robot reads the profile of the specific frame style. Then it uses one of several cutting heads to shave the excess off the corners. From here, the sash and frame go to another area to receive hinges. Meanwhile, workers cut the glass to size. They start with a huge sheet measuring about 6.5 feet by 10 feet. It's very heavy, about 200 pounds. So they lay it on a specially designed table. A blower sends up air through tiny holes. This floats the glass just above the surface, making it easy to move around. They score the glass using a sharp carbide cutting wheel. This window will have what's called a thermopane. 2 panes of glass with argon gas in between for insulation. One of the panes has a transparent metallic coating to reflect the heat back into the house. They adhere a strip of silicone foam around the perimeter of the first pane, notching it for a good fit around the corners. The foam is covered in a thin, strong polyester film to prevent the gas from leaking through. The strip is a spacer, creating a gap between the two panes that's just over a half inch for the